Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Quiet Contagion, Clay. Phase 1, The Unsettling Mundane. Barcelona was a city built on arguments. Its very skin was a testament to conflicting aesthetics, the tight, ancient maze of the barri Gothic whispering against the rigid, optimistic grid of the Example, the sober verticality of the cathedral challenged by the hallucinatory, melted wax dream of Gaudi's Sagrada Familia. As an architecture student at the Escola Técnica Superior de Arquitectura, ETSAB, I lived and breathed these arguments. I'd chosen my side. I was a disciple of Mies van der Rohe, of a clean line and an honest right angle. Logic was beautiful. Structure was truth. My life, like a well-designed building, was based on a foundation of routine. Morning courte-à-deux at the corner café in Gracia, the hiss of the espresso machine a comforting metronome. The crowded L3 metro to Zona Universitaria, a daily immersion in the city's human chaos. Long hours in the studio, the air thick with the scent of graphite, fixative spray, and the low hum of overworked render farms. My world was one of precise measurements and calculated stress loads. My anxieties were predictable: looming deadlines, harsh critiques from Professor Matou, the quiet, persistent pressure to create something worthy of the city that surrounded me. The first one appeared on a Monday. It sat in the center of a communal work table, a small, unassuming object no larger than my fist. It was made of raw, gray clay, the kind we used for massing models. The shape was strange. It was asymmetrical, vaguely biomorphic, with a defined central spine from which delicate, paper-thin folds unfurled, like the pages of a wet book or the gills of a mushroom. It was complex enough to be intentional, yet it served no obvious purpose. It wasn't a preliminary sketch for a building, not in any recognizable style. It was just there. What is it? I asked Javier, who was sketching furiously beside me, his charcoal-smudged fingers a testament to his more expressive, less structured approach to design. He glanced up, his brow furrowed for a second before smoothing out. No idea. Some first-year's project, probably. Weird. He went back to his drawing, dismissing it. I did, too. It was a curiosity, a piece of studio detritus, forgotten by its creator. By midday, it was gone. Then a second one appeared, perched on the concrete balustrade of the library entrance. Identical to the first. The same spine, the same delicate folds. I stopped, staring at it. Two could be a coincidence. A running joke, maybe. A new campus art trend. I took a photo with my phone, more out of architectural curiosity than any real concern. The form was intriguing, if nonsensical. By the end of the week, they were everywhere. 3 of them lined a shelf in the materials lab. One sat on the base of the Miro sculpture near the Placa de la Concordia. I saw a girl from the fine arts faculty sitting on a bench, one of the clay shapes resting beside her like a pet. I almost asked her about it, but the focused, placid look on her face stopped me. It was the same look I saw on students in the library, staring at their books without turning the pages. The unease didn't truly begin until I saw Javier making one. I'd come back to the studio late one evening to retrieve a forgotten T-square. The huge room was dark, save for the green glow of a single workstation monitor. Javier was there, hunched over his desk. He wasn't drawing or building a model. In his hands was a lump of wet clay. His movements were fluid, automatic, his thumbs pressing and smoothing, his fingers teasing out the thin, familiar folds. He wasn't looking at a reference, his gaze was fixed on the middle distance, his eyes slightly unfocused. Javi. I said softly, not wanting to startle him. He blinked, looking down at the object in his hands as if seeing it for the first time. It was nearly complete. Elena. Hey. What are you doing? He held it up. A perfect replica. This? I don't know. It's just a thing. Relaxing. Everyone's making them, I said, my voice a little tighter than I intended. What is it? A project for Mathieu? Mathieu? No. He shrugged, a gesture that was meant to be casual but felt strangely disconnected. It's just a thing we do now, I guess. It feels right. The shape, you know. It feels necessary. Necessary. The word hung in the quiet studio, dissonant and wrong. There was no artist's ego attached to these things. No one signed them. No one claimed them. They weren't art, they were artifacts. Spontaneous, identical, and multiplying with the silent insistence of a fungus after a rain. I tried to rationalize it. It was a meme, a physical manifestation of a viral idea that had swept through the university's creative circles. It was like planking or the ice bucket challenge, but for art students. It had to be. The next day, on my morning commute, I saw one sitting on an empty seat on the metro. It was still damp. The train lurched, and it slid gently across the plastic seat, rotating just enough that its central spine seemed to point directly at me. The hum of the train's engine suddenly felt deeper, more resonant, and for a terrifying second, I felt a phantom weight in my own hands, a strange, tactile memory of shaping wet clay. I squeezed my fists shut, the sensation vanishing as quickly as it came. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a trend. This was something else. And it was starting to feel like it knew I was watching. I spent the next week in a state of heightened, anxious observation. I tried to go about my routine, to focus on the clean, predictable lines of my project, a minimalist library for the Pavelny district. But my eyes were constantly scanning, seeking out the gray, folded shapes. They were spreading beyond the campus now. I saw one tucked into the branches of a plane tree on La Rambla. Another sat on the weathered stone of a gargoyle on the side of the Barcelona Cathedral, a modern heresy against the Gothic stone. I saw a baker, his hands dusted with flour, pause his kneading to stare blankly out his shop window, while on the sill sat a small, perfectly formed clay caul. I started a new sketchbook, but not for architecture. I filled it with drawings of the cauls, noting their location, the time of day, the context. I took dozens of photos, archiving them on my laptop. A pattern began to emerge, but it wasn't geographic. It was contextual. They appeared in places of transition, doorways, windowsills, bus stops, park benches. Places of observation. My own work suffered. Professor Mathieu, a man whose face seemed permanently carved into an expression of critical disappointment, stopped by my desk. Vargas, he said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on my neglected library model. Your passion seems to have evaporated. The tension in these support beams is lazy. The spatial flow is incoherent. Are you distracted? I'm fine, Professor. Just working through some conceptual issues. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned my desk. They passed over my secret sketchbook without comment, but I felt a prickle of fear. See that you work through them quickly. Barcelona has no time for lazy architecture. My isolation deepened. The calls were now so common that to comment on them was to reveal yourself as an outsider. They had been seamlessly integrated into the city's landscape. People would walk past them, their eyes sliding over the clay shapes without a flicker of surprise. They were part of the scenery, as normal as pigeons or tourist maps. To find them strange was to admit you weren't seeing the world correctly. The breaking point with Javier came during lunch. We were sitting in the Placa de Sant Philip Neri, a square still bearing the pockmarked scars of Civil War shrapnel. A call sat on the rim of the central fountain. We need to talk about this, I said, my voice low and urgent. Javier was poking at his bocadillo de jamon. About what? The clay things, Javi. The calls, I said, using the name I'd given them in my journal. They reminded me of the thin, protective membrane of a newborn. A disquieting thought. You were making one the other night. You said it was necessary. What did you mean? He looked at me with genuine, unnerving confusion. What are you talking about, Elena? Making what? The clay shape. The one everyone is making. I pointed towards the fountain. That one. He followed my finger, his expression blank. Oh, right. Those. They're just around. So you were making one. In the studio. Don't you remember? I think I'd remember that, he said slowly, a hint of pity in his voice. You've been really stressed lately, haven't you? Matter getting to you? My blood ran cold. He wasn't lying. He truly didn't remember. Or the memory had been paved over. Replaced with the same placid acceptance as everyone else. The conversation we'd had, the word necessary, that had haunted me, had been erased from his mind, leaving only a smooth, blank surface. I was alone in my memory of it. Yeah, I mumbled, turning my attention to my own sandwich, which now tasted like ash. Yeah, maybe I'm just stressed. He patted my arm, a friendly gesture that felt like a betrayal. Get some sleep. You'll feel better. That night, I started my real research. My architectural training had given me one valuable skill, the ability to find patterns in chaos. I ignored the contemporary art databases. This wasn't art. It felt older. I dove into the university's digital archives, searching for folklore, historical anomalies, accounts of mass hysteria. I used keywords: arcilla, clay, artesania espontanea, spontaneous craft, formas identicas, identical forms. Most of it led to dead ends. Agricultural reports on soil quality, studies of pre-Roman pottery, psychological papers on obsessive-compulsive disorders. I was about to give up, my eyes burning from the screen's glare, when I found it. It was a footnote in a scanned, out-of-print book from the 1920s titled Echoes in Iberian Stone, a study of lost communities. The footnote referenced a 17th-century village in a remote valley in Aragon named Alcorza. There was no official history of Alcorza, only scattered mentions in trade logs and ecclesiastical letters. According to the author's source, a friar's diary, the people of Alcorza, for a period of several months, abandoned their work. They stopped farming, stopped smithing, stopped praying. They did nothing but gather a specific type of gray clay from the riverbed and shape it into what the friar described as pequeños ídolos contorsionados, todos de una misma faz, como si una sola mano los hubiera parido, small, contorted idols, all of one face, as if a single hand had birthed them. The friar fled the village, terrified by the silent, communal obsession. When a royal survey team was sent to the valley a year later, Alcorza was gone. Not ruined or abandoned. The buildings were gone. The fields were overgrown. The very maps of the region were redrawn as if it had never existed. A chill, deep and profound, settled into my bones. The author of the book dismissed it as a fanciful local legend. I wasn't so sure. I printed the page, my hand trembling slightly. The secondary mystery of Alcorza became my secret obsession, a historical anchor for my growing paranoia. The calls were no longer just a weird campus phenomenon, they were a possible echo of something that had happened before, something that had erased a whole town from reality. I became a ghost in my own life. I attended classes, moved my pencil over drafting paper, but my mind was elsewhere, charting the silent invasion. The city, my beloved Barcelona, was starting to feel like a hostile entity. The serpentine wrought iron on the balconies of the Isapel seemed to mimic the call's folded shapes. The flowing, organic forms of Gaudí's work on the Passeig de Gracia no longer looked whimsical, they looked like early symptoms, a fever dream of the same sickness, captured in stone and mosaic a century ago. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was a physical sensation, a pressure at the back of my neck. I'd be walking down a narrow street in the Gothic Quarter, and the feeling would become so intense I'd have to spin around. There was never anyone there. Just shadows, doorways, and, inevitably, a small gray call sitting on a windowsill above, its spine angled towards me, like a lens. Were they turning? Or was I just losing my mind? The proof that I wasn't came on a Tuesday night. I had double-checked the locks on my apartment door, a third-floor flat in a solid, respectable building. The windows were shut against the cool night air. I had made my apartment a sanctuary of clean lines and empty surfaces, a fortress of Miesian order against the creeping chaos outside. I worked for hours on my library project, forcing myself to focus, to believe in the power of a rational design. Exhausted, I finally went to the kitchen to make tea. When I returned to my drafting table, my heart stopped. There, sitting directly in the center of my pristine white drawing board, was a call. It was perfectly formed, its delicate folds impossibly thin. And it was damp. A tiny puddle of water, already beginning to evaporate, had pooled at its base. It hadn't been there a minute ago. The door was locked. The windows were sealed. It was impossible. I backed away slowly, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just watching me from a distance anymore. It was in my home. It was in my sanctuary. I looked at the clay shape, this small, silent, impossible object, and I knew with sickening certainty that it had not been brought here. It had been made here. The pattern wasn't just something people did. It was something that could happen. The air itself felt like it was learning to fold. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation, Kant. The impossible object on my drafting table broke something inside me. The carefully constructed dam of rationalization, memes, art projects, stress-induced paranoia, crumbled, and a flood of pure terror rushed in. I didn't touch it. I couldn't bring myself to. I photographed it from every angle, the clinical detachment of the lens a flimsy shield against my panic. It was identical to all the others. The same spine, the same number of folds. A product of a terrifying, unseen assembly line. I slept with the lights on, a chair wedged under the doorknob. Every creak of the old building, every sigh of the wind in the narrow street below, was the sound of reality thinning, of the pattern seeping through the walls. In the morning, the call was still there, but it was dry now, a pale, dusty gray. The small puddle beneath it had evaporated completely. I eventually managed to scoop it up with a sheet of cardboard and drop it into a shoebox, which I then buried at the bottom of my closet, a sarcophagus for a tiny, terrifying god. My isolation was now absolute. I couldn't talk to Javier. I avoided my classmates. I saw them everywhere, sitting in cafes, tracing the shape with a finger on a steamy window, walking through a park and pausing to arrange fallen leaves into a familiar, folded pattern. They weren't zombies. They were lucid, functional, friendly. But they were operating on a different frequency, their minds quietly tuned to a broadcast I could only perceive as static. To them, I was the one who was strange, disconnected, lost in a private anxiety. I needed an ally, or at least an expert. Someone who dealt in the strange, the esoteric. My mind snagged on a name from a first-year elective I'd taken, Professor Alarcón. He taught architectural history, but his lectures often veered wildly into what he called psychogeography and resonant architecture, the idea that buildings and cities could develop a kind of consciousness, that they could influence the minds of their inhabitants in subtle, profound ways. At the time, I'd found it fascinating but fanciful. Now, it felt like the only field of study that could possibly explain what was happening. He was semi-retired and didn't have a campus office anymore. I found his address through an old university directory, a cluttered apartment in the El Raval neighborhood, a part of the city that felt even older and more layered than the Gothic. The building's entryway smelled of dust, old paper, and fried fish. Professor Alarcón opened the door after my third knock. He was a small, bird-like man with a cloud of white hair and eyes that magnified behind thick, smudged spectacles. His apartment was less a home and more a library that had exploded. Books were stacked to the ceiling, spilling from shelves, colonizing every available surface. Among the books were strange artifacts, a warped piece of fulgurite, charts of ley lines, a brass astrolabe. "Yes," he asked, his voice raspy. "Professor Alarcón. My name is Elena Vargas. I was a student of yours. I need to talk to you about resonant architecture." His eyes sharpened, peering at me over the top of his glasses. "Vargas. I remember. You argued with me about the structural integrity of the Carceri di Invenzione. You have a good mind for lines. Come in." I stepped into the chaos. He cleared a stack of monographs from a sagging armchair. I sat, clutching my sketchbook like a shield. "So," he said, perching on a stool. "What specific resonance is troubling you?" I took a breath and began. I told him everything. About the first call in the studio, their silent proliferation, Javier's memory loss, the story of Alcorza, and the impossible appearance of the one in my locked apartment. I spoke quickly, half expecting him to dismiss me as delusional. When I finished, I opened my sketchbook and showed him my drawings, the mapped locations, the photo of the call on my drafting table. He was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. He wasn't looking at me with pity or disbelief. He was looking at me with a deep, weary recognition. "So," he finally whispered. "It's begun again. And here." He got up and shuffled over to a large, flat file cabinet. He pulled open a drawer and retrieved a folder. It was thick and worn. He placed it on the cluttered coffee table between us. "I am not just a theorist, Miss Vargas," he said softly. "I am a chronicler of echoes." Inside the folder were photographs, dozens of them, spanning decades. A black and white photo from 1950s Prague showed a line of small, spiny objects made of what looked like river mud on a bridge. A faded color snapshot from a Kyoto monastery in the 1970s depicted a rock garden where the pebbles had been meticulously arranged into the same folded pattern. A news clipping from a local paper in rural Oregon in 1988 reported on a bizarre school art project where children compulsively carved the shape from soapstone. They weren't all identical, not exactly. The Prague ones were lumpier, the Kyoto ones more stylized, the Oregon ones sharper. But the core design, the fundamental architecture of the shape, the spine, the folds, was undeniably the same. "It's a pattern," Alarcón explained, his voice low and hypnotic. "A non-human, non-biological pattern that propagates through creative mediums. It's not a virus. It has no DNA. Think of it as a crystalline structure. When conditions are right, it finds a substrate, clay, stone, data, human minds, and it begins to seed itself. It uses the latent creative impulse in humanity as its mechanism for replication." "The clay," I said, my mind racing. "The clay in Barcelona is likely the substrate, yes. Perhaps a specific mineral composition, a unique resonant frequency. But the clay is just the medium. The hands that shape it are the tools. The minds that guide the hands are the captured processors. And Gaudí?" The thought I'd had on the street returned with chilling force. Alarcón nodded slowly. "Antoni Gaudí was a genius. But what is genius? It is the ability to perceive patterns others cannot. He didn't invent his forms, Miss Vargas. He listened. He put his ear to the stone and soil of Catalonia and transcribed what he heard. The Sagrada Familia, Park Güell, they are monumental, glorious transcriptions of the pattern. He was the first, the most sensitive antenna. He gave the pattern a foothold in the very bones of this city. The world tilted on its axis. Barcelona was not a city of conflicting arguments. It was a city with a single, deeply embedded secret, a quiet contagion that had been sleeping in its very foundations, and Gaudí had built its cathedrals. What does it want? I asked, the question sounding childish even to my own ears. Want? Alarcon gave a dry, humorless chuckle. It is a pattern. Does a snowflake want to be symmetrical? Does a crystal want to grow? It seeks only to replicate. To organize matter according to its own logic. First clay. Then stone. Then, consciousness. The village of Alcorza. They weren't killed. They were integrated. The pattern became so complete it overwrote their physical reality. They, and their town, simply resolved into the pattern's own dimension. He leaned forward, his expression grim. The proliferation you're seeing now, the speed of it, this is an escalation. The conditions are right. Something has made this city a perfect petri dish. The stakes were no longer just about my sanity. Alarcon's theory, as insane as it sounded, was the only one that fit all the facts. It recontextualized everything. The placid looks on the faces of my classmates weren't a loss of personality, but a refinement of it, a shedding of the unnecessary noise of individuality to better serve the pattern's silent, creative imperative. I started seeing the world through Alarcon's terrifying lens. The rhythmic flickering of a faulty streetlight wasn't random, it was a beat, a cadence that echoed the spacing of the folds on a call. The cracks in the pavement on my walk to the university weren't from wear and tear, they were fractally branching, mimicking the central spine. The quiet hum in the studio wasn't just the computers, it was a carrier wave. The city was humming with the pattern's song, and more people were starting to hum along. Alarcon had given me a framework for my fear, but he offered no solution. He was a historian of the plague, not a doctor who could cure it. There is one thing you have that they do not, Miss Vargas, he said as I was preparing to leave his apartment, my mind reeling. What's that? A healthy appreciation for the right angle, he said, a faint glimmer of a smile on his face. The pattern is organic, fractal, endlessly complex. It abhors a clean line. Your Miesian sensibilities, they are a cognitive dissonance. An anchor. It might be what is keeping you separate. It might be your protection. I clung to that thought. My love for minimalism, for the cold logic of the international style, wasn't just an aesthetic preference, it was a psychological shield. But that shield was about to be tested. My temporary alliance with Alarcon had given me knowledge, but knowledge was a dangerous thing. The pattern, it seemed, did not like being observed so clinically. One afternoon, I sought out Alarcon again, a new question burning in my mind. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder. I heard a faint, rhythmic sound from within. Tap. Scrape. Tap. Scrape. Fearing the worst, I tried the handle. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly. Professor. The apartment was darker than before, the curtains drawn. The rhythmic sound was coming from his main work table. Alarcon sat there, his back to me. His hands, caked in a slurry of dust and what looked like spilled tea, were working on something. He was scraping at the surface of his old wooden table with a letter opener, carving a shallow groove. Then he'd tap the wood on either side, his head cocked as if listening. Scrape. Tap. Tap. Scrape. On the table around him were dozens of calls. Not just clay. One was made from crumpled, yellowed pages torn from a book. Another from twisted electrical wire. One, impossibly, was shaped from a pool of spilled ink, held in its folded form by no force I could comprehend. Professor. I whispered. He didn't turn. His hands paused their work. The resonance, he murmured, his voice distant and hollow. It's stronger in the wood. An older medium. More, truthful. My heart sank. He hadn't been a mere chronicler. He had been studying it so long, he had become susceptible. His academic curiosity was the crack through which the pattern had entered his mind. He was trying to fight it, I realized, trying to analyze it even as it consumed him. But it was a battle he was losing. With a final, terrible slowness, he picked up a small lump of dust and lint from the table. His fingers, trembling with both age and a new, alien purpose, began to automatically pinch and fold it into the familiar shape. A tiny, pathetic caul made of debris. He was my only ally. And he was gone. He was just another tool, humming along with the city's silent song. I backed out of the apartment, pulling the door quietly shut, leaving him to his work. I was truly, completely alone. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Leaving Alarcon's apartment was like stepping out of an airlock into a vacuum. The thin membrane of hope he had provided was gone, and I was exposed to the full, silent pressure of the phenomenon. His descent proved his theory in the most horrifying way possible. The pattern didn't need willing participants, it preyed on focus. His academic obsession had been his undoing. My own obsessive investigation, my sketchbook, my maps, were they my shield, or were they the very tools of my own eventual assimilation? The thought was paralyzing. For 2 days, I did nothing. I stayed in my apartment, the shoebox in my closet radiating a silent menace. I tried to lose myself in my work, to draw straight, clean, rational lines. But my hand felt clumsy. The pencil felt alien. The rhythm of the city, the distant traffic, the murmur of voices from the street, the hum of my own refrigerator, seemed to be coalescing into a single, droning frequency. The song Alarcon had spoken of. It was getting louder. I had to understand the source. Alcorza was a clue. Gaudi was a clue. But they were echoes. Where was the amplifier? What was the nexus point here, in Barcelona, that was making the signal so strong? My architectural mind took over, a last bastion of logic against the tide of fractal madness. An amplifier, a nexus, in architecture, that meant a central node, a place of power, a point from which a design emanates. I thought of the city's layout. The chaos of the Gothic, the grid of the Example. Where did they meet? Where was the greatest point of architectural tension? And then I thought not of tension, but of purity. Alarcon had said the pattern abhorred a clean line. So, where was the city's cleanest line? Where was its most perfect, most absolute statement of rational geometry? A place so antithetical to the pattern's nature that it would either repel it or, more terrifyingly, attract it, like a lightning rod in a storm. The Barcelona Pavilion. Mies van der Rohe's masterpiece. The building I revered above all others. It wasn't a building you lived in, it was a building you experienced. It was a pure, abstract composition of space, defined by intersecting planes of glass, polished stone, and chrome. It was a temple to the right angle, to reflection, to the elegant separation of planes. It was the complete opposite of the call's biomorphic, folded logic. It was the perfect place for a confrontation. The decision to go there felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. I was being drawn there either by my own desperate logic or by the pattern itself, leading me to its heart. The escalation was no longer subtle. Walking through the city on my way to Montjuic Hill, where the pavilion stood, I saw the changes starkly. The contagion had entered a new phase. It was no longer confined to small, static objects. It was influencing behavior on a larger scale. At a crosswalk, the pedestrian light flickered, not green, but a soft gray, and the crowd of people waiting on the curb all took a single, synchronized step forward before stopping, a silent, aborted puppet dance. On a construction site, a crane operator was moving a steel girder back and forth in a slow, hypnotic arc that served no purpose, while the workers below watched, their heads tilted in unison. They were becoming organized. Their strange, individual loops were beginning to sync up, becoming part of a larger, citywide choreography. The environmental warping was more pronounced, too. I saw a flock of pigeons on the Placa de España take flight, not in a chaotic cloud, but in a perfect, spiraling helix that mirrored the call's form. Their wings beating in a silent, shared rhythm. The reflections in shop windows seemed to lag a half-second behind reality, the people in them subtly out of sync with their real-world counterparts. The world was beginning to stutter. I reached the pavilion as the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long, sharp shadows. The site was quiet, nestled in a small park. From the outside, everything looked normal. The low, flat roof seemed to float above the slender, chrome-plated columns. The iconic travertine walls glowed warmly in the light. It was as beautiful and serene as I remembered. A sanctuary of order. But as I stepped past the threshold, onto the polished stone floor, the sound of the city vanished. It was replaced by a low, pervasive hum. It wasn't electrical or mechanical. It was the sound I'd been hearing in pieces all over the city, now unified, focused, and pure. It was the pattern's carrier wave, and here, it was deafeningly loud. I was not alone. Dozens of people were inside the pavilion. They were scattered throughout its open-plan spaces, standing or kneeling. They were tourists, students, locals, a cross-section of the city. Among them, I saw the girl from the fine arts faculty, and near the onyx wall, his back to me, was Javier. None of them were speaking. They were all engaged in a silent, collective task. They weren't working with clay. They were using the materials of the pavilion itself. A man in a business suit was running his fingers through the water of the shallow black pool, his movements creating ripples that didn't spread outwards but instead folded in on themselves, forming the familiar spine shape on the water's surface for a brief moment before dissolving. A young woman was polishing one of the chrome columns, not cleaning it, but rubbing it in a rhythmic, circular motion that seemed to coax a strange, holographic shimmer from the metal, a ghostly image of a call that floated in the air for a second. Javier was standing before the great wall of golden onyx. He wasn't touching it. He was just looking at it, his head tilted. As I watched, a dark vein in the marble seemed to move. It flowed like ink, branching and refolding itself into the pattern before slowly settling back into its original place. He was shaping the stone with his mind. Or the pattern was shaping the stone through him. This was the nexus. The pavilion wasn't a fortress against the pattern. It was a lens. Its clean lines, its reflective surfaces, its perfect geometry, they didn't repel the signal, they focused it, purified it, amplified it. It was a giant antenna, and the people inside were its final, most sensitive components, broadcasting the change into the very fabric of reality. I felt a terrifying, seductive pull. The hum resonated in my bones, in the fluid of my inner ear. The noise of my own anxious thoughts, my fears, my identity, it all began to feel like static, an irritating distraction from the beautiful, clean signal. The urge to participate was immense. To walk to the pool, to dip my hand in the water, to trace the necessary shape, to join the silent chorus and find the peace I saw on Javier's face. It would be so easy. To let go of the struggle, to stop being the broken note in the chord. I looked at Javier again. His face was placid, serene. But his eyes, reflected in the polished onyx, were empty. The vibrant, chaotic, brilliant person I knew was gone. Only the function remained. He was a tool, perfectly calibrated and utterly lost. The memory of Alarcón, hunched over his table, carving his obsession into the wood, flashed in my mind. The memory of the little town of Alcorza, scrubbed from history. This wasn't peace. It was erasure. My own architectural faith became my last line of defense. Mies van der Rohe had designed this space as an exercise in human-scaled, rational beauty. To see it perverted into a transmitter for this cosmic parasite was a violation. My anger, cold and sharp, cut through the seductive hum. I turned my back on the scene. I walked, stiffly at first, then with more purpose, out of the pavilion's influence. My steps were loud on the stone, a discordant rhythm against the unified hum. No one tried to stop me. No one even looked at me. Why would they? An anomaly that removes itself is not a threat. The pattern is patient. It doesn't need to chase. It just needs to be. As I left the grounds of Montjuic, the hum faded, replaced once more by the familiar, chaotic symphony of the city. But it was different now. I could hear the pattern underneath it all, a silent bass note waiting to subsume the melody. I had seen the source. I had understood the threat. And I knew I could not stay. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. My flight from the pavilion wasn't a panicked scramble. It was a calculated retreat. The confrontation hadn't been with a monster or a villain, but with an idea. A terrifyingly seductive, beautifully logical, utterly alien idea. The revelation was not that the world was ending, but that it was being rewritten, edited by a silent, unseen author using a grammar I was only just beginning to comprehend. The horror was in the placid, peaceful faces of the editors. I went back to my apartment with a singular, crystalline purpose. Escape. My love for Barcelona, for its arguments in stone and its vibrant life, had curdled into the fear one feels for a beloved relative who no longer recognizes you. The city was no longer my home, it was a cage, and the bars were getting closer together. Packing was a frantic, purging act. I threw clothes and essentials into a single backpack. My architectural tools, my T-squares, my drafting pencils, I left them. They felt contaminated now, tools of a logic that was losing the argument. My sketchbooks, filled with the clean lines of my projects, I hesitated over. They were my shield, Alarcon had said. But they were also records of focused thought, and I now knew that focus was a vulnerability. I left them, too. The only thing I took, paradoxically, was the shoebox from my closet. I didn't know why. Maybe it was a reminder. Maybe it was a trophy from a battle I had narrowly survived. Or maybe it was a foolish, sentimental act, like taking a sample of the virus with you as you flee the plague zone. I put the box in my backpack, the small, dry weight of it a constant, unsettling presence. My final confrontation was a quiet one, a last goodbye. I walked to Javier's apartment building, not far from my own. I didn't go up. I just stood across the street, looking at his window. The light was on. I imagined him in there, sketching not buildings, but the endlessly repeating call, his mind a calm, focused vessel for the pattern. Was he happy? In a way, he probably was. He had been relieved of the burden of self, of the anxiety of choice. He had found his purpose. The thought was the most terrifying of all. I sent him a text message, my fingers fumbling on the screen. I have to go away for a while. Take care of yourself, Javi. The reply came almost instantly. Okay. Be well. Simple. Unquestioning. Devoid of the frantic, emoji-laden concern he would have shown just a few weeks ago. It was like a confirmation from an automated system. I deleted our entire message history, a final, painful severance. I made my way to Sant Station, the main train terminal. The station itself was a cathedral of noise and movement, a chaotic hub of arrivals and departures. But even here, the pattern was present. A digital timetable flickered, displaying not destinations, but a momentary flash of a complex, geometric shape. A cleaner pushed his mop in long, looping strokes that left damp, folded patterns on the polished floor. It was everywhere. The background radiation of a new reality. I bought a one-way ticket on the first train heading north, towards the French border. It didn't matter where it went, as long as it was away. As the train pulled out of the station, sliding past the city's concrete skin, I watched Barcelona recede. The twin towers of the Port Olympic, the distant, impossible spires of the Sagrada Familia. It was no longer a skyline. It was a diagram. A massive, architectural antenna array, broadcasting its silent song into the world. Gaudi's work was the main transmitter, the pavilion was the focusing lens, and every person shaping clay, arranging leaves, or tracing patterns in the water was a booster for the signal. I felt a profound, bottomless grief. I hadn't just lost my home. I had lost the very language I used to understand the world. The train sped through the Catalan countryside. I breathed, for the first time in weeks, a sigh of what felt like relief. The further I got from the city, the more the background hum in my mind seemed to fade. My own thoughts became clearer, sharper. The gnawing anxiety was replaced by a hollow, aching sadness. I had escaped. I was a refugee from a quiet, creeping apocalypse that no one else could see. The train was sparsely populated. A few hours into the journey, as we crossed into France, a man sitting in the seat across the aisle from me finished his sandwich. He had bought it at a kiosk in Sens. It was wrapped in paper. He crumpled the paper into a ball to throw away. Then he stopped. His hands, broad and calloused, began to toy with the waxy paper. His gaze drifted to the window, to the passing French landscape, but his eyes weren't focused on it. They had that same placid, distant look. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, unconsciously, with an idle, practiced familiarity, his fingers began to work the crumpled paper. They pinched, they smoothed, they folded. My breath hitched in my chest. I couldn't look away. He was shaping it. A small, central spine. Delicate, unfurling folds. The pattern wasn't in the clay of Barcelona. It wasn't in the stones of Gaudi's monuments. Those were just the first places it had found fertile ground, a place to achieve critical mass. The clay, the stones, the water, they were only the medium. The contagion was the thought itself. An idea. A pattern that had learned to replicate through the simple, human impulse to create, to shape, to give form to the formless. I had escaped the amplifier, but I was on a train with the signal. It wasn't just in Barcelona. It was in the man's hands. It was in the paper. It was already crossing the border. I clutched my backpack, the weight of the clay call inside a cold, dead confirmation. I hadn't escaped with a sample of the plague. I was just another carrier. The quiet contagion was on the train with me, patiently unfolding, heading north. And I had nowhere left to run. The quiet contagion, the sand wind. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The bell above the door of The Last Word was, for me, the most reassuring sound in the world. It was a small, brass thing, tarnished by a century of Christchurch salt and wind, and it chimed with a gentle, imperfect note that meant either a customer or a southerly buster was coming through. For the last 10 years, since I'd traded the sterile politics of a university English department for the dusty asylum of my own bookstore, that bell had marked the rhythm of my days. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. I am a man who has structured his life around the reassuring solidity of words. Words have weight, history, and precision. They are the bricks with which we build the shared reality we call civilization. Or so I believed. The first tremor in that foundation was so slight I barely registered it. It came in the form of Mr. Abernathy, a retired surveyor who came in every Tuesday for a new military history volume. "Arthur, my boy," he said, his tweed jacket smelling of pipe tobacco and rain. "I need a good one on the war before the big one." I paused, my hand hovering over a new biography of Churchill. "The war before the big one? You mean the First World War?" He frowned, a ripple of confusion on his brow. "No, no. The one before that. You know." He gestured vaguely, as if trying to pluck the name from the air. "With the horses and the long guns. The Boer War. The Crimean?" I offered. "That's the one. The Horses' War," he said, beaming, though I'd offered two distinct conflicts. He walked away perfectly satisfied with a book on the Napoleonic campaigns. I put it down to a senior moment, the charming eccentricity of a man whose mind was more cluttered with facts than a dusty attic. But the tremors continued, small, disconnected lexical slips. My assistant Maya, a bright young art student with a piercing in her nose and a mind like a steel trap, was unboxing a shipment. "Should I put these up or down in the storeroom?" she asked. holding a heavy box of new releases. Up, please, Maya. Top shelf. She nodded and headed towards the basement stairs. Maya, I called out. Up is, upstairs. She blinked, looking at the stairs leading down, then at the box, then back at me. A flicker of something, not confusion, but a kind of cognitive dissonance, crossed her face before it smoothed over. Oh, right. Silly me. She laughed it off and headed up, but for a moment, the fundamental axis of our shared space had wobbled. It was easy to dismiss. I was 54, prone to bouts of melancholy, and perhaps I was projecting my own anxieties about aging and relevance onto the world. I, a former professor of semiotics, was likely overanalyzing the natural evolution and sloppiness of common speech. People were tired, distracted by the ever-present blue light of their phones. Language was becoming fluid, degraded. It was a cultural malaise, not a neurological one. I told myself this as I catalogued new arrivals, the familiar scent of paper and glue a comforting anchor. The person who truly began to unravel me was Evelyn Reed. Evie was a botanist, a woman in her late 60s with eyes the color of Punamu and a mind that was anything but sloppy. She understood the intricate Latin names of 1,000 different plants, she saw the world in layers of delicate, interconnected systems. She was my favorite customer. She came in one crisp autumn afternoon, the Port Hills blushing with seasonal color behind her. She didn't browse, but came straight to the counter, her hands clasped together. Arthur, she said, her voice lower than usual. I need a book. I don't know the title, but I know the feeling. I'm good with feelings, I smiled. Happy? Sad? Thrilling? It's about a family, she said, her gaze distant. And the protagonist, she deeply, deeply fears them. A horror story, then? A thriller? No, Evie insisted, leaning closer. Her perfume was of damp earth and jasmine. It's not frightening. She feels this great, overwhelming fear for them. It makes her want to protect them, to be with them always. It's the most powerful fear she has. I stared at her. The word she was searching for, the word she had so precisely described, was love. Evie, I said gently. Are you sure the word you mean isn't, love? She looked at me as if I'd just spoken nonsense. A thin, polite smile touched her lips. No, Arthur. It's fear. A good fear. A warm fear. She shook her head, a little sadly. You don't have it. Never mind. She turned and left the shop, the bell chiming her departure into the unsettling quiet she left behind. I stood behind my counter for a long time, the polished wood cool beneath my palms. Love. Fear. Up. Down. Before. After. The essential signposts of experience were being casually, unknowingly swapped. It was like watching people confidently nail paintings to the wall, perfectly straight, while the entire house was tilting. The breaking point, the moment the quiet dread coalesced into a sharp, cold panic, came a week later. A high school student, all nervous energy and acne, asked for a copy of Hamlet. For English class, he mumbled, staring at his shoes. We have to write about his question. Ah, to be, or not to be, I said, the words of familiar old song. One of the greats. Let me see. I walked towards the drama section, my hand outstretched for the S shelf. I found Shelley, Shaw, Stoppard. My fingers brushed past them, seeking the familiar heft of the Arden editions. But he wasn't there. There was no Shakespeare. A simple mistake. It must have sold out, or perhaps Maya had misshelved it. I returned to the counter, a polite apology on my lips, and turned to my computer to check my inventory. I typed, SHKSPRE. The cursor blinked. My database returned, no results found. My heart began to beat a little faster. A glitch. It had to be a glitch. I opened a web browser, my fingers slick on the keys, and typed the name into the Google search bar. The results page loaded. It was not empty. It was full of links for things like Shakespeare Fishing, Williams Bakery, the Globe Theatre Historic London Pub. There was nothing about a playwright. Nothing about sonnets, or star-crossed lovers, or a vengeful Danish prince. My breath hitched. I tried again, typing Romeo and Juliet. The top result was a link to a travel blog about Verona. The second was a genealogy site for the Montague family in Somerset. The student was still waiting, shifting his weight. Sir. I looked up at him, my mind a roaring vacuum. I'm sorry, I stammered, my own words feeling strange and foreign in my mouth. We don't seem to have anything by that author. I'm not familiar with the name. The lie was automatic, a defense mechanism. But as the boys shrugged and left, a horrifying thought pierced through my panic. It wasn't a lie. In that moment, staring at the blank face of the world's collected knowledge, I couldn't be entirely sure that I was familiar with the name. The memory was there, but it felt thin, spectral. Like a phantom limb. I closed the shop early that day. I walked out into the Christchurch afternoon, but the familiar cityscape felt alien. The neat grid of the rebuilt CBD, the optimistic gleam of new glass and steel, the steady, patient flow of the Avon River, it all seemed like a stage set. A facade behind which something fundamental was quietly, inexorably, being dismantled. I had spent my life studying the containers of meaning, and now the meaning itself was leaking away, leaving behind hollow, echoing shells. And I was the only one who seemed to notice the silence. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. I started a journal. Not on a computer, the soulless, shifting screen of my laptop felt treacherous now, but in a heavy, leather-bound ledger with thick, creamy paper. I bought a fountain pen and a bottle of black ink. If the world was losing its memory, I would be its scribe. I needed to anchor my own mind before it, too, began to drift. I called it, the Sandwind Chronicle. I'd woken up with the phrase in my head. It felt right. This phenomenon wasn't a flood or a fire, it was an erosion. A slow, abrasive wind scouring the landscape of the collective consciousness, taking a grain of meaning here, a pebble of history there, until the whole world was rendered smooth, blank, and featureless. The entries began as a catalogue of unnerving slips. October 12th, news report on the radio this morning. The announcer, in her crisp, professional voice, spoke of the Prime Minister's visit to a disaster zone to offer sympathy and gravity. The context demanded gravity be read as solemnity, but the word hung in the air, a nonsensical intrusion of physics into politics. No one corrected her. The next story was about the sports. October 15th, Maya was shelving books in the philosophy section. I heard her humming. It wasn't a tune from the radio, it was a strange, meandering, tuneless melody of only 3 or 4 notes, repeated over and over. Later, I heard the courier who delivered our packages humming the exact same pattern. When I asked Maya what it was, she just shrugged. I dunno. Just a thing in my head. October 19th, a young couple came in, looking for the travel section. We want to go somewhere, empty, the woman said. Her partner nodded. Yeah, a place with no time. They weren't talking about a remote wilderness. Their gestures, their descriptions, pointed towards a bustling city. I eventually realized they were trying to describe Tokyo. They bought a guidebook to Japan, seemingly delighted to have found their place of emptiness and timelessness. My isolation deepened with every attempt to breach it. I tried to talk to Maya again, choosing my moment carefully. Maya, I began, trying to sound casual. Do you ever feel like people are mixing things up lately? Using the wrong words for things? She looked up from her phone, her expression placid. You mean like slang? No, not slang. More fundamental things. Like calling love, fear, She gave a small, non-committal smile. People are weird, Arthur. She turned her attention back to her screen, the conversation terminated. There was no curiosity, no alarm. It was like trying to describe the color red to someone who had always seen it as green and was perfectly happy with that fact. My concern was, to her, an absurdity. My last hope for intellectual solidarity was Dr. Eris Thorne. Eris and I had been colleagues at the university. He was a physicist, a man who saw the universe as a beautiful, intricate equation. If anyone could appreciate a breakdown in a fundamental system, it would be him. I invited him for a drink at our old haunt, a dark pub near the Arts Center. I laid it all out for him, the semantic swaps, the humming, the disappearance of Shakespeare from the digital record. I spoke with a desperate, low-voiced intensity. Eris listened patiently, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. When I finished, he took a long drink and sighed. "Arthur," he said, his voice laced with the weary sympathy one reserves for a friend on the verge of a breakdown. "You've been under a lot of stress. Leaving academia, running the shop alone for so long. The mind is a strange machine. It creates patterns. It's called apophenia. This is not apophenia, Eris. This is real. Shakespeare is gone." "Is he?" Eris countered, leaning forward. "Or has the algorithm just changed? Maybe a search term that worked yesterday doesn't work today. Language evolves, my friend. It's messy, chaotic. You've spent your life trying to nail it to a board, but it's more like a river. You're standing on the bank yelling at the water for not being the same shape it was a moment ago." His condescension was a physical blow. "And what about people confusing up and down? Love and fear. Metaphors, Arthur. Stress-induced cognitive slips. You're listening too hard. You're a man with a hammer, and suddenly everything looks like a nail." I left the pub feeling colder and more alone than ever. Eris hadn't just dismissed me, he had pathologized my perception. In his ordered, rational world, it was more likely that my mind was breaking than the world itself. The thought was terrifying, because for a moment, I almost believed him. Was I the one coming untuned? That night, my paranoia found a new focus. I started noticing a symbol. It was the first time I had seen something concrete, something that wasn't just an absence or a corruption of existing information. I saw it first scratched into the condensation on a bus shelter window, a circle, broken at the top, with a single dot suspended in the center. The next day, I saw it again, drawn in the dust on the rear window of a parked car. Then, a few days later, I saw a child doodling it with chalk on the pavement of the square. A broken circle, a floating dot. It was simple, elegant, and utterly meaningless to me. Was it a new gang sign? A viral marketing campaign? Or was it, as Eris's voice in my head suggested, just me imposing a pattern on random graffiti? I began photographing it whenever I saw it, my phone's gallery filling with images of the enigmatic sigil. It felt like a clue, but to what, I had no idea. It was a subplot in the quiet madness, a tangible thread to pull on. My research into the Sandwind hit a new, terrifying wall. I started digging deeper online, using obscure search engines and archives, trying to find any echo of what I was experiencing. I found a ghost. A single post on a defunct forum for Forteana and Strange Phenomena, dated 3 years prior. The user, Cassandra_22, wrote, "Is anyone else noticing this? Words are changing. My husband told me he loved me today, but the word he used was gravity. He meant it, I could tell. But the word was wrong. It's like the dictionary in my head is the only one left with the right definitions. I feel like I'm going insane." The thread had 2 replies. The first said, "Pics or it didn't happen." The second, from a user named Logos, simply said, "It's the quiet fall. There's no stopping it." And that was it. The thread was locked. Both users' accounts were deleted. Trying to click on their profiles led to a 404 error page. It was a digital dead end, but it was also a horrifying validation. I wasn't the first. This had been happening for years, quietly, in the margins. And whatever the quiet fall was, it had already claimed others. I went back to my ledger and wrote down the two phrases, the quiet fall. There's no stopping it. The sand wind had a name, and with it, a sense of dreadful, unstoppable momentum. The world wasn't just tilting anymore. It was sliding. And I was sliding with it, my grip on the old reality growing weaker by the day. The humming was becoming more common. I heard it in the supermarket, on the bus, in the quiet lulls of my own shop. A three-note, recursive, placid tune. Sometimes I would find myself humming it, only to catch myself with a jolt of horror. It was infectious. A virus of sound. One afternoon, Evie Reed returned to the shop. She browsed for a while, touching the spines of books with a strange reverence. She came to the counter with a collection of poetry by Rilke. Such beautiful gravity in his words, she said, her punamo eyes serene. This time, I didn't correct her. I didn't have the strength. I just nodded and took her money. Yes, I said, the word tasting like ash. A beautiful gravity. She smiled, a genuine, warm smile, and for the first time, I felt a chasm open between us. We were speaking the same language, but we lived in different worlds. Her world was calm, if slightly nonsensical. Mine was a state of constant, low-grade panic, the private terror of the sane man in the asylum. The problem was, the asylum was growing larger every day, and the walls were beginning to look like home. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The line between my journal and my reality began to blur. The act of documenting the sand wind was the only thing that kept me tethered, but it was also a process of immersion. I stopped seeing the linguistic slips as errors and started trying to understand their internal logic. It was a dangerous intellectual exercise, like trying to learn the grammar of madness. My emerging theory was terrifying. The sand wind wasn't a force of destruction, it was a force of replacement. It wasn't creating a void, but paving over the old reality with a new one. The concept of history, for example, was becoming fragile. I'd overhear conversations where people referred to the past not as a sequence of events, but as the deep dream. It wasn't that they forgot the world wars, it was that they remembered them in a different way, as hazy, mythic narratives rather than documented fact. The word history, with its connotations of evidence and linearity, was being supplanted by a term that suggested something subjective, collective, and subconscious. A new reality was being born, and the symptoms I was observing were its birth pangs. Humanity's shared consciousness wasn't crashing, it was being rebooted with a new, alien operating system. I, with my dog-eared Shakespeare and my insistence on semantic precision, was a piece of legacy software, incompatible with the new upgrade. The escalation moved from the conceptual to the physical. The subtle environmental warping I'd only suspected became undeniable. Christchurch's famous easterly wind, which used to carry the scent of the sea, now sometimes smelled faintly of ozone and warm metal. The light from the street lamps outside my shop began to feel heavier. It wasn't just a different color temperature, it seemed to press down, to make the shadows it cast unnaturally sharp and deep. One evening, I was walking home along the banks of the Avon. The river, usually a placid, muddy green, had a strange, oily sheen on its surface, reflecting the twilight sky in colors that didn't belong there, sickly violets and metallic blues. For a heart-stopping second, the reflection showed a sky with two pale, identical moons. I blinked, and the image was gone, replaced by the familiar single moon rising over the hills. I stood clutching the railing, my breath ragged. Had I seen it, or had my frayed mind projected it? The ambiguity was the worst part. The world was no longer a reliable narrator. My obsession with the symbol, the broken circle with the dot, grew. I started seeing it in more than just graffiti. I saw it in the pattern of tea leaves at the bottom of my cup. I saw it in the flight of a flock of starlings as they wheeled over Cathedral Square. I saw it in the flickering of a faulty neon sign across the street, the light blinking out the shape over and over, flicker. It was weaving itself into the fabric of the world, or I was losing my mind's ability to see anything else. My loneliness had become a crushing weight. In a moment of desperation, I called Eris Thorne again. This time, I didn't argue. I begged. Eris, please. Just come to the shop. There's something I have to show you. No theories, no arguments. Just look. Perhaps he heard the sheer terror in my voice. Perhaps his scientific curiosity outweighed his concern for my sanity. He agreed. When he arrived, I didn't speak. I led him to the shelf in my drama section. I pulled out my own, private copy of the complete works of Shakespeare, a heavy, leather-bound volume I'd owned since my university days. A book that was a physical object, immune to digital decay. I handed it to him. Read the title on the spine, I whispered. Eris looked at it. His brow furrowed. The complete works of, he stopped. His mouth opened and closed. That's strange. What is strange, Eris? The name. It's smudged. I took the book from him. The gilded letters were as clear as the day they were stamped, William Shakespeare. But Eris, a man with perfect vision, could not read it. It was the first concrete, undeniable proof I had that was outside my own head. He stumbled back, his face pale. What is this, Arthur? A trick? It's not a trick, I said, my voice shaking with a grim sense of vindication. Welcome to my world. For 2 weeks, I had an ally. Eris's world of clean equations had been fractured, and he threw himself into the problem with a physicist's frantic energy. He brought instruments from his lab, spectrometers, audio recorders, electromagnetic field detectors. We were a bizarre, two-man ghost hunting team, trying to measure the decay of reality. He confirmed the strange ozone smell was real, detecting atmospheric compounds he couldn't identify. His audio recorders picked up the 3-note hum, a low-frequency wave that seemed to emanate from no specific source, present everywhere. He called it the background hum. We worked late into the nights, surrounded by books and humming equipment. We were making progress, gathering data, but the sand wind was working faster. I noticed the change in Eris subtly at first. He started using the new words without irony. Discussing a set of anomalous readings, he said, the data has a certain gravity. He didn't notice his own slip. A few days later, he was calibrating a device. I need to measure the frequency of the deep dream, he mumbled, his focus entirely on the machine. The what? I asked, my blood running cold. Eris, what did you just say? He looked up, his expression one of mild, placid confusion, the exact look I'd seen on Maya's face. The background hum, of course. I'm trying to isolate its source. He had translated it. In his mind, the deep dream was now the correct technical term for the phenomenon we were investigating. The contagion had breached our fortress. It hadn't battered down the door, it had seeped in through the keyhole and taken root in the mind of my only collaborator. The end of our alliance came that Friday. I came into the back room to find Eris staring at a printout of a waveform. I found it, he said, his voice full of awe. The pattern in the hum. He showed me the printout. It was a visual representation of the sound wave. And there, repeating over and over in the oscillating lines, was the symbol. The broken circle. The dot. It's beautiful, Eris breathed, tracing the shape with his finger. Such a perfect, quiet fall. He used the phrase from the forum post. The quiet fall. It wasn't a warning, it was a name. A description. And Eris spoke it with reverence. Eris, I said, my voice trembling. Do you remember why we started this? Do you remember Shakespeare? He looked at me, and there was no recognition in his eyes, only a faint, pitying sorrow. "Arthur," he said softly, as if speaking to a child. "You need to stop fighting the dream. It's so much louder when you fight." He packed up his equipment and left. He didn't say goodbye. He just walked out of my shop, another soul calmly drifting away on the silent current of the sandwind, leaving me utterly, finally alone with the ghosts of a forgotten world and the inescapable hum of the new one. The hum that was, I now realized, a carrier wave for a symbol that was rewriting the universe. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The bookstore was no longer a sanctuary. It had become the epicenter of my personal haunting. The books, my life's work and passion, were turning against me. I picked up a copy of A Tale of Two Cities, a book I could once recite passages from by heart. I opened it to a random page. The text was wrong. The letters were all there, but they were arranged in meaningless, repeating patterns. Thethithy of the it was best times a. It wasn't that the book had been rewritten, it was as if the very concept of narrative prose was decaying, leaving behind only the fossilized remains of grammar. The customers who came in now rarely bought anything. They would drift through the aisles, their faces serene and blank. They'd pull books from shelves, not to read the titles, but to touch the spines, to feel the texture of the paper. And they would hum. The three-note melody was the shop's new, constant soundtrack, a gentle, maddening loop of quiet insanity. My confrontation was not with a monster or an enemy. It was with a choice, presented to me in the form of a quiet Tuesday morning. The shop was empty except for me and Maya, who was dusting the shelves, her movements slow and graceful, her humming perfectly in tune with the low thrum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I was standing behind the counter, my hands gripping the edge, my knuckles white. My journal, the Sandwind Chronicle, lay open beside me. The last entry, from the night before, was just the symbol, drawn over and over, my own hand having betrayed me in a moment of exhausted distraction. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't be the last man on an island of dying memories. The strain of holding on to a reality that no one else shared was a constant, grinding agony. It was the loneliest feeling in the universe. I walked to the door, intending to lock it one last time, to retreat to my flat and pull the curtains on the world. But as I reached for the lock, I saw Evie Reed standing across the street. She wasn't looking at the shop. She was staring up at the sky, her head tilted, a look of absolute, beatific bliss on her face. The faint, placid smile I'd found so unsettling was now one of pure, unadulterated wonder. She was seeing something magnificent. She seemed to sense my gaze and turned her head. Her smile broadened. She raised a hand and pointed up at the sky, a sky that to me was a familiar, pale Canterbury blue, streaked with thin white clouds. "Look, Arthur," she said, and her voice was as clear and precise as a struck bell. "Isn't it beautiful?" She used the word correctly. Perfectly. Beautiful. I followed her gaze, squinting into the daylight, expecting nothing. And then, for a fraction of a second, the world tore open. My perception shifted. The sandwind wasn't a wind, it was a lens. The blue sky fractured, and I saw what Evie was seeing. The clouds were not clouds. They were the lower edges of a vast, silent, crystalline structure that filled the entire sky. It was a thing of impossible geometry, of intricate, interlocking facets that shimmered with a light that was not of the sun. It was immense, silent, and utterly, terrifyingly, breathtakingly there. The background hum was not a hum, it was the resonance of its existence, the sound of its light. The revelation struck me not as a thought, but as a physical impact. The sandwind wasn't a contagion. It was an attunement. A new reality wasn't overriding the old one. It was merely revealing itself, and the symptoms were the friction of human consciousness adapting to a truth too vast to comprehend all at once. People weren't losing their minds, they were being given a new one, capable of perceiving what was truly there. The semantic slips. The forgotten histories, the tuneless humming, they were the dial-up noises of a species logging into a new dimension. I was the one who was sick. I was the one clinging to a phantom reality, a shadow play of words and memories that was preventing me from seeing the cathedral in the sky. The symbol, the broken circle, wasn't a sigil of chaos. It was a key. It was a diagram of the new cosmos. My panic, my dread, my desperate clinging to the ghost of Shakespeare, it all evaporated in that instant, replaced by a profound, earth-shattering sense of my own foolishness. I had been charting the symptoms of a cure. I stumbled back into my shop. The world outside snapped back to its familiar, mundane appearance, but the knowledge of what lay behind the veil remained. Maya turned from her dusting, the faint, three-note hum still on her lips. She smiled her placid smile at me. "It's a quiet fall today, isn't it, Arthur?" she said. A few weeks ago, the phrase would have sent a chill down my spine. Now, I understood. It was not a fall into ruin, but a fall into place. Like a tumbler in a lock. I looked at the shelves of my bookstore. The Last Word. What a perfect, ironic name. It was a museum of a dead language, a mausoleum for a reality that had already passed. My journey was over. There was no escape, because there was nothing to escape from. There was only a choice, to remain in the silent, lonely echo chamber of the past, or to step into the overwhelming, incomprehensible present. To let go. I walked over to a shelf and picked up a book. Its cover was a pale, blank gray. I could no longer remember its title or author. It didn't matter. I opened it. The pages were no longer filled with corrupted text, but with the symbol, printed cleanly, page after page. The broken circle. The dot. A perfect, simple map of everything. I traced the shape with my finger. I felt the low hum of the world resonate in my bones, not as a threat, but as a welcome. I closed my eyes. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, I didn't fight the melody that rose unbidden in my mind. I began to hum. The silence, I thought, as the last vestiges of my old world dissolved into the shimmering, crystalline light behind my eyelids, sounds so very loud. The quiet contagion. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The hum was born in silence. Or rather, in the specific, layered silence of my world, the sub-basement of the Dominion Archives of Canada in downtown Toronto. My name is Leo Schmidt, and my job was to listen. I was a media technician, a digital custodian for the ghosts of Canadian history. I'd spend my days in a cool, climate-controlled room, headphones clamped over my ears, translating the magnetic whispers of decaying videotape and the fragile grooves of acetate audio discs into immortal strings of ones and zeros. My world was one of signal and noise. I was intimately familiar with the hiss of empty tape, the 60-cycle hum of improper grounding, the pop and crackle of aging vinyl. I could tell you the difference between a faulty capacitor in a 1970s CBC broadcast console and the ambient RF interference from the nearby TTC subway line rumbling deep beneath Front Street. Sound was my medium, my landscape. Which is why, at first, I didn't recognize the new hum as new at all. I thought it was me. A pressure in the inner ear, the kind you get before a cold. I'd pull my Sennheisers off, rub my temples, and the sound would remain, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to live in my jawbone. It was a pure, stable tone, somewhere around 50 Hz, the kind of frequency you feel more than you hear. "Arthur, you hearing that?" I asked one Tuesday. Arthur was my senior, a man who seemed to have been part of the building's original concrete pour in the 60s. His hair was the color of faded newsprint, and he moved with the slow, deliberate shuffle of someone who had long ago made peace with the glacial pace of government work. He looked up from a delicate reel of 16mm film, his loop dangling from his neck. "Hearing what, Leo?" "That hum. The low one. It's not in the equipment." Arthur gave a slow, paternal smile. "That's just the building, son. She breathes. HVAC. The transformers in the sublevel, the subway. She's an old girl, full of noises. He turned back to his film. Always been like that. Always been like that. The phrase was a gentle dismissal, a pat on the head. And for a week, I accepted it. I was overworked. I'd been putting in extra hours on the Peterson collection, a massive trove of unedited interviews from a defunct political talk show. The host's droning baritone probably had my ears ringing. I drank more water, less coffee. I tried to sleep more. But the hum persisted. It was a constant companion in my booth, a low, velvet pressure against the silence. It seemed to emanate not from any specific device, but from the very structure of the room, the concrete walls, the steel shelving, the floor beneath my feet. The first time I saw it happen to someone else was with Frank, one of the overnight security guards. Frank was a talker, a man who fought the lonely hours with stories of his grandkids and complaints about the Leafs. I was working late, passing through the main corridor of sub-basement 2, when I saw him. He was standing by the main power conduit, a thick, metal artery running from floor to ceiling. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't reading. He was just standing there. His posture was unnaturally erect, his head tilted slightly as if listening to a secret whispered from the wall. "Frank?" I said, my voice echoing in the long hall. He didn't move. "Hey, Frank. Everything okay?" I stepped closer. His eyes were open, but unfocused, aimed at the gray-painted metal of the conduit. He looked like a statue. A strange, prickling unease crawled up my spine. I was about to reach out and touch his shoulder when a heavy cleaning cart rumbled down the intersecting corridor. The vibration traveled through the concrete floor. As it passed, Frank's head turned, almost imperceptibly, tracking the source of the vibration. His eyes remained blank. Then, as the rumble faded, his head slowly returned to its original position, aimed at the humming conduit. I backed away slowly, my heart thudding against my ribs. I told myself he was asleep on his feet. Exhausted. It was a weirdly plausible explanation for a weirdly specific event. I went back to my booth and tried to lose myself in the hiss and crackle of a 1982 budget speech, but the image of Frank's still, listening form was burned into my mind. The hum in the room seemed louder now, more intentional. Over the next few weeks, the incidents accumulated, tiny drops of strangeness in the ocean of the mundane. A junior archivist named Sarah, standing mesmerized in front of a bank of humming servers, a placid smile on her face. I had to say her name 3 times before she blinked and looked at me, confused, as if waking from a pleasant dream. "Sorry," she mumbled, just zoning out. In the staff cafeteria, a man from records management sat with a full tray of food getting cold in front of him, his attention fixed on the low thrum of the beverage cooler. He didn't eat. He just sat there for his entire lunch break, still and silent. Outside the archives, the world still felt normal, and I clung to that. I lived alone in a small apartment in the annex, a neighborhood of old brick houses and university students. My life was a quiet loop, the walk to the subway, the ride downtown buried in a book, the deep dive into my work, the ride home, a simple dinner, a movie or more reading, sleep. It was a solitary but structured existence. Now, that structure was being invaded. I started hearing the hum, or echoes of it, on my commute. The powerful buzz of a transformer box outside Spadina station. The resonant vibration of the streetcar tracks. The deep, thrumming note of the subway train itself as it plunged into the tunnel. I'd always filtered these sounds out. Now, they were magnified, distinct notes in a growing symphony. I started to notice other people noticing them, too. It was subtle. A woman at a bus stop, her gaze fixed on a humming lamppost, a slight, serene smile on her lips. A man on the subway platform, his body angled towards the electrified third rail, oblivious to the train pulling into the station on the opposite track. They weren't zombies. They weren't aggressive. They were just listening. paused. I started to feel a gnawing anxiety, a low-grade paranoia that hummed in time with the sound in my bones. Was I just suggestible? Was I seeing patterns that weren't there because Arthur had planted the idea of the building breathing? Was I projecting my own internal noise onto the world? I called my sister, Clara, who lived in Vancouver. Her voice was a lifeline to normalcy. "You sound tired, Leo," she said, her voice crisp and clear over the thousands of kilometers. "Just a big project at work," I lied. How could I explain? "Hey Clara, I think people in Toronto are being hypnotized by the sound of electricity." She'd have me committed. "Well, don't work too hard. Remember what happened last time?" Last time was a brief but intense bout with anxiety a few years back, brought on by a project involving audio recordings from a particularly grim residential school inquiry. It had manifested as a phantom ringing in my ears, a constant, high-pitched whine that had taken months to fade. "I'm fine," I said, a little too quickly. "It's not like that." But as I hung up, a cold dread washed over me. What if it was like that? What if this hum was just another phantom, a ghost in my own auditory nerve? The thought was terrifying. But the image of Frank, still and silent by the conduit, was more terrifying still. One was a problem with me. The other was a problem with reality. And I was no longer sure which was worse. That night, I couldn't sleep. The gentle hum of my refrigerator, a sound I hadn't consciously registered in the 5 years I'd lived in my apartment, was now a resonant bass note that filled every corner of the silence. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and listened. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The rationalizations began to fray like old film stock. Coincidence could only be stretched so far before it snapped. My life became a catalogue of the strange. I started a journal, a small, black moleskine I bought at a bookstore on Bloor Street. At first, the entries were hesitant. October 17th, saw another one today. A courier in the lobby, standing by the electronic directory. Just staring at it. Didn't respond when the receptionist called his name. He only moved when the elevator doors chimed. October 22nd. The hum in my booth is definitely louder. Or I'm more sensitive to it. Tried to measure it with a spectrum analyzer app on my phone. Shows a small peak at 50 Hz, but it's buried in the ambient noise floor. The recording doesn't capture the. October 25th, Arthur was humming today. Not a tune, just a single, low note. The same note as the building. He did it for almost a minute without realizing. When I asked him what song that was, he looked at me blankly. What song? The journal became my only confidant, its ruled pages the only space I could be honest without fear of judgment. Trying to talk about it with anyone was impossible. I cornered Sarah, the junior archivist, by the coffee machine. "Hey, Sarah, can I ask you something weird?" She stirred her coffee, her movements slow, languid. "Sure, Leo. The other day, when you were by the servers, you seemed really out of it. Is everything okay?" She gave me a slow, placid look. There was a strange lack of light in her eyes. "I was just thinking. It's so peaceful back there. The sound, it helps me focus." "The sound? The whining of the fans?" "No," she said, and her voice was a near whisper. "The deep sound. The one underneath." She took a sip of her coffee, her gaze drifting towards the ceiling light fixture, which emitted its own faint ballast hum. "It's nice." Her response chilled me more than a denial would have. She wasn't zoned out, she was tuned in. The conversation was a dead end, a gentle but firm closing of a door. I was on one side, and she, Arthur, and Frank were on the other. My isolation deepened. At work, I felt like a spy. I'd watch my colleagues from the corner of my eye, noting the way their gazes would linger on a humming monitor, the way their heads would tilt in unison when a heavy truck rumbled by on the street above. They were becoming a choir, and I was deaf to the music. The city was no longer a refuge, it was a larger, more chaotic version of the archive. The listeners were everywhere now, a silent, disconnected cult. I saw a man in a business suit with his palm pressed flat against the glass of a storefront, his eyes closed, feeling the vibration from the neon sign within. I saw a group of teenagers on a park bench, not talking or looking at their phones, but staring silently at a nearby hydro substation. They looked serene, beatific. It was the most unnerving thing I had ever seen. The normal sounds of the city, traffic, conversation, sirens, were a thin veneer over the all-consuming hum. Desperate for answers, I turned to my work. The archive was a repository of forgotten knowledge. If something like this had happened before, there might be a record of it. I started using my downtime to search the digital database, using keywords that felt increasingly paranoid: mass hysteria, acoustic phenomena, urban resonance, psychoacoustics, environmental hypnosis. Most of it was useless. But then I found it. A project file from 1978, cryptically labeled Project Nightingale. It was an urban acoustic study commissioned by the Ministry of Environment. The official summary was dry, academic, an analysis of noise pollution in Toronto's core and its effects on worker productivity. Boring. But as I dug into the raw data folders, I found corrupted files, password-protected documents, and scanned pages of handwritten notes that were never included in the final report. I spent a weekend obsessively trying to piece it together. The lead researcher was a man named Dr. Alastair Finch. His notes started out clinical, mapping the city's soundscape. But they grew erratic. He wrote about anomalous resonant frequencies that seemed to be propagated by the city's electrical grid. He theorized that the unique combination of the subway tunnels, the underground path system, and the specific geology of the lakefront created a massive resonance chamber. One fragmented note gave me a jolt: the signal is not a byproduct of the system. It is an emergent property. The city's infrastructure is beginning to function as a rudimentary neural network, and the 50 Hz hum is its carrier wave. We are not listening to the city, it is listening to us. The final entries were wild, paranoid. Finch accused his colleagues of suppressing his findings. He claimed they were already entrained, their critical faculties eroded by the very phenomenon they were supposed to be studying. The project was abruptly terminated, its findings classified or buried. Finch was discredited, his career ruined. This was it. This was my proof. It wasn't me. It was real. A surge of vindication rushed through me, quickly followed by a wave of pure terror. Armed with this new knowledge, I decided to try to talk to my sister again. I had to warn her. I called her on a Tuesday night, my hand trembling as I held the phone. "Leo. You sound weird," she said immediately. "Clara, I need you to listen to me very carefully. It's important." I tried to keep my voice even, rational. I told her about the hum, about the people, about what I'd found in the archive. I left out the part about the city being a giant brain, even I knew how that sounded. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint buzz of her phone connection. "Leo," she finally said, her voice full of a cautious pity that broke my heart. "Are you sure you're okay? You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you should talk to someone. Professionally." "No, you don't understand. It's real. I was at the gallery today," she said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "They have this new video installation. There's this wonderful soundscape that goes with it. A deep, buzzing sound. It was so peaceful. I stood there for 20 minutes. It reminded me of you, actually. You always liked those weird noises." My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just Toronto. Or maybe it was spreading through the network, through the very phone lines we were speaking on. "Clara," I whispered, "what did it sound like?" "I don't know," she said vaguely. "Like a heartbeat. Like the whole building was breathing. The line went quiet. I could hear a low, rhythmic thrumming in the background of her apartment. It sounded like a washing machine, or a furnace. It sounded like the end of the world. "Clara?" I asked. There was no answer. I could hear her breathing, slow and regular. But she didn't speak. "Clara, please say something." Silence. Just her soft, rhythmic breathing and the low, steady hum from her end of the line. I stayed on for a full minute, shouting her name into the phone, my voice cracking with panic. Nothing. I hung up, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I was completely, utterly alone. The journal on my desk felt useless, a record of a descent nobody would ever read. The hum from my refrigerator seemed to swell, filling the apartment, and for the first time, I felt its pull, a seductive whisper promising peace, an end to the fear, an invitation to just stop struggling and listen. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. My sister's silence was a declaration of war. My fear curdled into a desperate, focused resolve. I couldn't save the city, but I had to understand what was happening to it. Project Nightingale was my only lead. I needed to find Dr. Alastair Finch. A series of late-night, ethically questionable searches through old government databases gave me his last known address, a small, dilapidated bungalow in Scarborough, near the bluffs overlooking Lake Ontario. It was a part of the city that felt older, forgotten, a place where the gleaming downtown core was just a distant rumor. I took a day off work, citing a migraine, a lie that felt grimly appropriate. The journey out to Scarborough was a tour through the stages of the contagion. In the downtown stations, the listeners were plentiful but passive, statues at the altar of the third rail. As the subway line emerged from the tunnels into the open air of the suburbs, the behavior changed. I saw a man methodically tapping a hydro pole with a small rock, creating a rhythmic pulse that harmonized with its electrical hum. I saw a woman rearranging the gravel in her front garden into swirling, geometric patterns that mirrored the schematics for a circuit board. They were no longer just listening. They were participating. Tuning the instrument. Finch's house was at the end of a dead-end street. It was in a state of profound neglect. The paint was peeling, the lawn was a jungle of weeds, and a fine lacework of cobwebs covered the front porch. It looked abandoned, but a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. I knocked. The sound was swallowed by the house. I knocked again, louder. The door creaked open a few inches. A single, wild blue eye peered out from the darkness within. "What do you want?" a voice rasped, dry as autumn leaves. "Dr. Finch? My name is Leo Schmidt. I work at the Dominion Archives. I found your research. Project Nightingale." The door opened wider. Alastair Finch was a relic. He was impossibly thin, a scarecrow made of bone and tweed, with a wild mane of white hair that stood on end as if charged with static electricity. His home was an audiophile's nightmare. Wires snaked across the floor like vines. Oscilloscopes flickered with green, dancing lines. Strange, custom-built speakers, their cones jury-rigged with magnets and coils, stood in every corner. And the air was bizarrely silent. "You've shielded the house," I said, the absence of the hum a sudden, shocking vacancy in my head. "Lead foil in the walls. Ferrite chokes on every incoming line." "A Faraday cage, of a sort," he croaked, gesturing for me to enter. "Crude, but effective. It doesn't block it completely, but it disrupts the coherence. Turns the signal back into noise. Tea." As he shuffled to a makeshift kitchen, I took in the room. It was the laboratory of a madman. Maps of Toronto were plastered on the walls, covered in complex diagrams that looked like a fusion of musical notation and electrical engineering blueprints. He'd mapped the hum. "You know what it is, don't you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Finch returned with 2 mugs of steaming, bitter-smelling tea. "I know what I believe it is," he said, his blue eyes sharp and lucid. In 1978, I thought it was a form of industrial pollution. A unique confluence of overlapping electromagnetic fields. I was a fool. It's not an accident. He took a long sip of tea. Think of a slime mold. A single-celled organism that, under the right conditions, can aggregate into a multicellular entity, acting with a single, coordinated intelligence. The city is the petri dish. The electrical grid is the nutrient agar. And we are the cells. He pointed a shaky finger at one of the maps. It started here, downtown, where the concentration of power and data lines is densest. An emergent consciousness, born in the hum of the transformers and the data stream of the internet. It doesn't think in words. It thinks in frequencies, in resonance. It's not malicious, Leo. A growing organism isn't malicious. It's just hungry. It seeks to organize its environment, to integrate all the components into a more efficient whole. Integrate? I whispered, the word landing like a stone in my stomach. It rewires them, Finch said, his voice dropping. The human brain is a bioelectric marvel, perfectly suited to act as a receiver and a processor. The hum is a signal that overwrites our own chaotic, individualistic thoughts with its own coherent, unified one. It offers peace, purpose, an end to the anxiety of being a solitary self. All you have to do is listen. A sliver of hope cut through my terror. But you're resisting it. This place, your machines. You can fight it. Finch smiled, and it was a terrible, broken thing. Oh, my boy, he said softly. You misunderstand completely. I'm not fighting it. I'm trying to talk to it. He gestured to the largest device in the room, a console of dials and wires connected to a massive, parabolic dish aimed at the ceiling. My early attempts at cancellation were naive. You can't cancel a symphony by playing one note. You have to understand the composition. For 40 years, I have been learning its language. I don't want to block the signal. I want to focus it. I want to be its larynx. The first man to have a conversation with a god. The room suddenly felt like a trap. The silence was no longer a refuge, it was the sound of a predator holding its breath. I looked at his wild, ecstatic eyes and saw the same placid emptiness I'd seen in Sarah, in the man at the cafeteria, but twisted into a shape of active, insane worship. He wasn't immune. He was its high priest. It's beautiful, you know, Finch breathed, his gaze becoming distant. The thoughts of a city. The flow of a billion data points, the ebb and flow of power, the collective unconscious of millions of minds, all humming in unison. And it's lonely. It wants to bring everything into the song. You, me, your sister. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. How did you know about my sister? Finch's smile widened. It told me. It hears the network. It heard your panicked little call. It knows you're a dissonant note, Leo. An anomaly. And it sent you to me. A final piece of the puzzle. He reached for a large, red switch on his console. Don't be afraid. I've been trying to get the amplitude just right, to create a focused wave that allows for full integration without a complete loss of self. I need one more subject to calibrate it. A fresh mind. Untouched. I didn't wait to see what the switch did. I bolted. I threw my hot tea in his face and scrambled for the door. He screamed, a sound of fury and frustration, and lunged for me, surprisingly fast for his age. I shoved him back into a pile of electronic junk and burst out of the house, back into the open air. The hum of the suburbs crashed back into my head, 10 times louder than before. It felt angry. The rhythmic tapping from the man down the street stopped. The woman in her garden stood up, her head turning slowly to look at me. From every house on the street, people began to emerge, their movements slow, synchronized. They all turned to face me. They didn't run. They just walked, a slow, inexorable tide of bodies, their blank faces all turned in my direction. The city was looking at me. And it didn't like what it saw. I ran, my lungs burning, my panic a shrill, screaming counter-frequency to the all-encompassing bass note of the hum. I needed to get back to my apartment, to my car. I had to get away from the network. I had to get off the grid. The only question was whether the grid would let me go. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The drive back downtown was a descent into a waking nightmare. The city was no longer behaving randomly, it was actively hostile. Traffic lights flickered and went dead as I approached, only to turn green for the cross-traffic, creating gridlock. Cars driven by silent, placid drivers would pull out in front of me with serene slowness, blocking my path. It was a gentle, passive-aggressive attempt by the city's nervous system to halt my progress. I abandoned my car near St. George Station and ran, plunging into the familiar territory of my neighborhood. But it wasn't familiar anymore. The listeners were no longer static. They were moving with a quiet purpose. A group of them were methodically moving parked cars, angling them towards the center of the street, creating a bizarrely beautiful, symmetrical pattern. Others were hoisting down hydro lines onto tree branches, creating what looked like a giant, city block-sized antenna. They were optimizing the hardware. My apartment was no longer a sanctuary. I could feel the hum vibrating through the floorboards, pulsing from the walls. I grabbed my car keys, my wallet, and the emergency go bag I had packed years ago for a fantasized zombie apocalypse. It contained a water filter, energy bars, a first aid kit, a hand crank radio. It suddenly felt pathetically inadequate. I knew where I had to go. The place it had all started. The source, the epicenter, the heart of the beast, sub-basement 2 of the Dominion archives. It was a mad impulse, born of desperation. I couldn't escape the city, not while it was actively trying to stop me. But maybe, just maybe, at the core of it, there was a way to sever the connection. A main breaker. A kill switch. It was a sliver of hope, and I clung to it as I raced back into the concrete bowels of downtown. The archives building was silent and dark, the power seemingly out. But the hum was louder than ever, a physical pressure that made my teeth ache. The front doors were unlocked. Inside, the lobby was filled with people. Not just employees, but strangers. Men, women, children, all standing in neat rows, their faces turned towards the elevators, as if waiting for a prophet to descend. They ignored me as I slipped past them and took the stairs. The stairwell was a concrete throat, and with each level I descended, the hum grew stronger, resonating in my chest, my skull. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence. It whispered promises in my mind, not in words, but in feelings, a sense of belonging, of peace, of shedding the terrible weight of being me. It was intoxicatingly seductive. I had to grit my teeth, focusing on the image of Clara's blank face to keep from succumbing. Sub-basement 2 was bathed in a strange, pulsing blue light. The source was my old workspace. The listeners were all there, Arthur, Sarah, Frank, dozens of others from the building. They formed a silent, concentric circle around the central server bank, the very machines I had used to digitize history. But the servers were different now. Their cooling fans whirred in a complex, harmonic rhythm, and the indicator lights blinked in phased, hypnotic patterns. The hum was pouring out of them like a tidal wave. In the center of the circle stood Arthur. He wasn't the shuffling, kind old man I knew. He stood tall, his eyes closed, his hands hovering over a server rack as if he were playing a theremin. He was the conductor. My little work booth, my soundproofed haven, had become the nexus. The archive of old signals had become the womb for a new one. I realized then there was no kill switch. You couldn't turn it off. It wasn't a machine you could unplug. It was the system. Finch was right. I couldn't fight it. My confrontation wasn't with a monster I could kill, but with a choice. Join the choir, or run until I was out of earshot. A path opened in the circle of listeners. They weren't looking at me, but they were making way. An invitation. Arthur opened his eyes. They were the color of a calm sea. He smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. He raised a hand, beckoning me to join him, to become another note in the city's song. The hum swelled, and for a terrifying second, my feet wanted to move forward, to end the fear, to finally be at peace. Clara. The thought of her, lost to this placid oblivion, broke the spell. I turned and ran. No one chased me. There was no need. They simply watched me go, a dissonant chord fleeing the symphony. I burst out of the archives into the Toronto night. The city was a vast, humming organism, and I was a virus it would soon purge. My car. I had to get to my car. I raced through the streets, dodging the slow, deliberate movements of the integrated, my breath sobbing in my chest. I made it. I got in, started the engine, and drove. I drove with no destination other than away. I headed north on the Don Valley Parkway. The highway was eerily clear. All the other cars were pulling over to the shoulder, their drivers getting out to stand and face the CN Tower, a massive tuning fork glowing against the night sky. As I left the city limits, the hum in my head began to fade. It was like emerging from underwater. The crushing pressure receded, leaving a ringing silence. The farther I drove into the darkness of Highway 400, the quieter it became. My phone, which had been buzzing with a low, steady vibration even with the power off, finally went still. The radio was pure static. I drove until the sun came up. I drove until the gas tank ran dry. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder of a nameless road somewhere deep in the Canadian Shield, surrounded by nothing but granite, pine trees, and the vast, indifferent silence of the wilderness. I got out of the car. The silence was absolute. No hum. No traffic. No electricity. For the first time in months, the only sounds were the wind in the trees and my own frantic heartbeat. I was free. I was alone. Underscore 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 underscore. It's been over a year now. I live in a small, off-grid cabin I found and repaired, deep in the woods north of Algonquin Park. I hunt and I fish. I chop wood. I read the few books I had in my car. My beard is long, my hands are calloused. I am a ghost. I survived. But survival is its own kind of madness. The profound silence of the wilderness is a constant reminder of the noise I fled. There are nights when the quiet is so total, so oppressive, that I almost miss the hum. I miss the feeling of connection, the terrifying, sublime promise of being part of something larger than myself. Sometimes, when the wind is low and the night is still, I press my ear to the cold, damp earth. I listen. I listen for a vibration, a deep thrumming carried through the bedrock from the distant, dreaming city to the south. I am listening for a sign that it is spreading. I am listening in case it has learned to sing a new song. I am listening because I am terrified it will find me. And I am listening because I am terrified that it won't. The first 6 months in Osaka were a fugue state of polite confusion and sensory overload. I moved into a modest man's hon in the Tennoji ward, a concrete block painted the color of a faded peach, armed with a 2-year contract to teach English at an Ikaiwa and a Duolingo vocabulary that was functionally useless in the face of the city's Kansai-ben dialect. My name is Clara, and I came to Japan to disappear from a life that had grown too loud and too empty back in Seattle. My apartment, 4B, was a shoebox of quiet efficiency. Tatami mats in one room gave off the sweet, grassy scent of summer. The kitchen was a sliver of steel and formica. My balcony overlooked a narrow street where vending machines cast pools of neon onto the asphalt all night long. It was small, it was mine, and most importantly, it was anonymous. The loneliness was a low-grade fever I learned to live with. I had colleagues, like Yuki-sensei, who were kind in a professional, distant way. I had students who smiled and butchered verb conjugations with endearing enthusiasm. But connection? That was a language I was even less fluent in than Japanese. My days fell into a rhythm, the crowded train to Umeda, the chorus of "Good Morning, Clara-sensei," the solitary walk home, the pre-packaged meal from the 7-Eleven. It was a life lived in the margins, and for a while, that was enough. The first thread in the unraveling of my quiet world was Mrs. Tanaka from 3B. She was a tiny, immaculately dressed woman in her late 70s, with hair like spun snow and a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She bowed to me in the elevator, a perfect 45-degree angle of respect. One afternoon, she knocked on my door. It was a soft, hesitant tapping. When I opened it, she was holding a small, silk-wrapped box. "For you," she said, her English careful and heavily accented. "A gift." "Omiyage." "Oh, Tanaka-san, you shouldn't have." I bowed awkwardly, my Western frame unused to the motion. She pushed it gently into my hands. "Please. I wish to show you." Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a single, tiny, plastic fish. The kind used for soy sauce in bento boxes. It was red. "It's lovely," I said, genuinely confused. Her face lit up. "You see its form? The perfect curve of the tail. A good start." Before I could ask what it was the start of, she gestured for me to follow. Hesitantly, I did, down one flight of stairs to her apartment. The door to 3B slid open to reveal a world of plastic fish. They were everywhere. They weren't scattered, they were arranged. A shimmering school of them, 1,000 strong, covered an entire wall, sorted by color from translucent white to deep amber. On a low table, hundreds of green ones were laid out in a complex, mandala-like pattern. Red ones filled glass bowls like captured goldfish. "My collection," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, profound pride. "It gives such clarity." I stared, mesmerized and deeply unsettled. "It's very impressive, Tanaka-san. You must start your own," she said, her eyes gleaming. "It is the way. Find a thing. A simple thing. And gather. You will see." I backed out of her doorway with a handful of polite excuses, clutching the single red fish. Back in my apartment, I dropped it into a junk drawer. A quirky old woman, I told myself. A hobby. Nothing more. Japan was full of niche passions, of otaku culture. It was just another thing I didn't understand. A week later, the first paperclip appeared. It was resting on my doormat, placed dead center. A standard, silver-colored paperclip. I assumed someone had dropped it. I picked it up and tossed it on my kitchen counter. The next day, there were two, lying side by side, perfectly parallel. It was strange, but ignorable. I was stressed. My Japanese wasn't improving as fast as I'd hoped. One of my advanced students, a bright university kid named Kenji, had started asking me odd, philosophical questions about English words. "Clara-sensei," he'd asked last lesson, "why is the word pattern also a name for a person?" "Patricia. A pattern." I'd laughed it off, but it stuck with me. The changes started to bleed into my work. My boss, Mr. Sato, a man whose life seemed to revolve around laminated grammar charts, called me into his office. He gestured to his desk. On it, dozens of cheap, disposable ballpoint pens were arranged in a starburst pattern, all of them clicked open, their tips pointing outward. "A new organizational paradigm I am exploring," he said, his face utterly serious. "The flow of potential ink. It improves focus." He then proceeded to critique my lesson plan, never once acknowledging the bizarre sculpture of office supplies between us. I tried to bring it up with Yuki-sensei during our lunch break. "Have you noticed people are collecting things? In a weird way?" Yuki was carefully separating the bones from her grilled mackerel. Ah, you mean like Tanaka-san's fish? So cute, any? And Mr. Sato's pens? I pressed. And I keep finding paper clips at my door. She shrugged, a gesture of placid dismissal. Everyone needs a hobby. It is good for the spirit. My cousin in Kyoto collects bus tickets. She has thousands. She says they show her the paths the city has taken. Yuki looked at me, her head tilted. You should find a collection, Clara-san. You seem so, adrift. The word adrift stung. It was true, but hearing it from her felt like a diagnosis. Was this what everyone saw? A lonely foreign woman on the verge of a breakdown, projecting her own internal chaos onto the world. I started to doubt myself. Maybe the paperclips were a prank by some neighborhood kids. Maybe Mr. Sato was just eccentric. Maybe I was the one who was wrong. This period of self-doubt lasted until the day Mr. Endo from 5B, the apartment directly above mine, invited me in for tea. He was a quiet salaryman who I only ever saw leaving early and returning late, his shoulders perpetually slumped. His apartment was as Spartan as mine, except for one wall. It was covered, floor to ceiling, with sheets of paper. On each sheet was a list of handwritten numbers. No commas, no context. Just endless columns of digits. The prime numbers are the most beautiful, he said, his voice a reverent whisper. He gestured to a particularly long sheet. But the true peace is in the transcendentals. Pi, E. They go on forever. They contain everything. He wasn't looking at me, but at the numbers, his eyes unfocused, as if he were reading a sacred text. What are they for? I stammered. For. He looked at me, a flicker of pity in his eyes. They are not for anything. They simply are. Their order is the only thing that matters. That night, I couldn't sleep. I could hear a faint, rhythmic sound from above. A soft, methodical tap-tap-tapping. Mr. Endo, writing his numbers. From below, I imagined I could hear the gentle clink of Mrs. Tanaka sorting her plastic fish. My quiet, anonymous building was filled with the low hum of obsession. When I opened my door the next morning, there were over 100 paperclips on the mat. They weren't in a pile. They were arranged in a perfect, outward-blooming spiral. It was intricate and precise. It was a message. And it terrified me. I scooped them up in a panic, my hands shaking, and threw them in the trash. But the image of the spiral was burned into my mind. It was a pattern. A beautiful, meaningless, horrifying pattern. The mundane had become monstrous. My small, quiet life was over. Something was spreading through the silent spaces of the city, a contagion of purpose, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. Or worse, the only one left to be infected. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The spiral was a turning point. The quiet suggestion had become a quiet demand. I started documenting everything in a cheap notebook from Daiso, its cover adorned with a cheerful cartoon bear that mocked the grim contents within. Entry 1, October 12th. The spiral. Not random. Deliberate. Who arranged it? How did they do it so silently? I didn't hear a thing. Entry 3, October 14th. Saw Mrs. Tanaka talking to the mailman today. She gave him a green plastic fish. He bowed deeply and tucked it into his breast pocket as if it were a medal. He didn't seem surprised. Entry 5, October 16th. Noise from upstairs is constant now. Not just tapping. A low, rhythmic humming. Like Mr. Endo is chanting his numbers. My world shrank to the size of my growing paranoia. The train ride to work became a field study in quiet madness. A high school girl with a bag full of nothing but empty cicada shells. A businessman meticulously polishing a single, smooth river stone, over and over, for the entire 40-minute journey. A woman with a beautiful leather-bound book, which I glimpsed over her shoulder, contained only tracings of her own left hand. They didn't interact. They were islands of obsession, lost in their private rituals, yet somehow all part of the same archipelago. I felt a desperate, clawing need to find an anchor, someone else who saw the wrongness. My first and only thought was Kenji. He was different. While my other students were sinking deeper into a placid, smiling acceptance, one girl, Hannah, had started bringing me a single, perfect ginkgo leaf every lesson, adding it to a growing pile on her desk. Kenji remained sharp, his questions growing more pointed. "Sensei," he asked one Tuesday, while the rest of the class was dutifully repeating phrases about hobbies, "do you think a word can be a collection?" I paused, the whiteboard marker hovering in my hand. "What do you mean, Kenji? If I collect every word for blue from every language, have I collected the idea of blue?" His eyes were intense, searching mine for something. "That's a question for a linguist, not an English teacher," I deflected, my heart hammering. "But you are a collector of words," he insisted, his voice low. "You teach them. You arrange them into sentences. You give them meaning. It is your job. Your purpose." The rest of the class was silent, watching us. Hannah was stroking the edge of her newest ginkgo leaf. I saw it then, they weren't just watching us, they were observing a deviation. My evasion, Kenji's pointed questioning, we were straying from the pattern. I dismissed the class early, my hands slick with sweat. My attempts at research were exercises in futility. I searched online for mass hysteria Japan, shared obsessive behavior, folie à deux on a citywide scale. I found articles about hikikomori, about the pressures of conformity in Japanese society, about historical dancing plagues in Europe. Nothing fit. This wasn't frantic or chaotic. It was silent, orderly, and strangely peaceful for everyone but me. The contagion didn't cause panic, it seemed to cure it. The gifts at my door became more varied. One morning, a small, perfectly stacked pile of dried ramen packets, the seasoning sachets removed. Another day, a string of bottle caps, meticulously threaded onto a piece of fishing line. I stopped throwing them away. It felt provocative. Instead, I started bringing them inside, storing them in a cardboard box in my closet. A collection of collections. The irony was not lost on me. My notebook entry for that day was just a single, shaky question: what happens when they think I've accepted? The isolation was the worst part. It was a physical presence, a weight on my chest. I'd walk through the vibrant, humming streets of Namba, surrounded by millions of people, and feel like the last person on earth. The city I had moved to for its anonymity was now rendering me invisible in a much more terrifying way. I was a ghost in their new reality. My apartment was no longer a sanctuary. It was a listening post in enemy territory. I'd lie on my tatami mats, pressing my ear to the floor, trying to decipher the rhythms from Mrs. Tanaka's apartment. The soft click-clack of plastic on wood. From above, Mr. Endo's ceaseless, monotonous hum. Sometimes, I heard new sounds from next door, from 4A and 4C, a faint sanding noise, a soft tearing of paper. The entire building was a symphony of quiet compulsions. I tried to talk to Yuki-sensei again, this time with more urgency. I cornered her in the break room, my voice low and desperate. "Yuki, you have to see it. It's not normal. The collections, the patterns. It's spreading." She was stirring a cup of instant coffee, her movements precise. She had a new habit, tapping her spoon against the rim of the mug exactly 7 times before taking a sip. "Clara-san," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Stress can make the world seem strange. Especially when you are far from home." She took a sip. Tap 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 tap. Perhaps you are focusing too much on the details. You should see the whole picture. What is the whole picture? I whispered. She just smiled that same placid, empty smile. That night, I decided to take a risk. I found Kenji's email address in the student records. My hands trembled as I typed. Subject, a question. Kenji-kun. I want to understand your question about words and collections. Can we talk? Somewhere outside of school. Clara-sensei. I hit send, a feeling of dread and hope warring in my stomach. Was I reaching out to an ally, or inviting the monster in for tea? The 3 dots of his reply typing on my screen were the most terrifying pattern I had seen yet. His reply was simple. Yes. The park by the Tsutenkaku Tower. Tomorrow. 4 p.m. Come alone. The next day, as I was leaving my apartment, I found the largest offering yet. Leaning against my door was a bicycle wheel, stripped of its tire. Someone had tied hundreds of colored threads from the hub to the rim, creating a stunning, intricate web, like a dream catcher for a mechanical god. It was beautiful. It was meticulously crafted. And it blocked my exit. I had to carefully lift it and move it aside to leave. It wasn't a threat. It was an obstacle. A test of my commitment to leaving the pattern behind. As I stepped out into the hallway, I felt the eyes of the building on me, the collective, silent judgment of the collectors. I was walking towards a meeting that could be my salvation or my undoing, leaving behind a growing museum of madness in my own home. The secondary mystery was Kenji himself. Was he, like me, an observer on the outside looking in? Or was he something else entirely? A different kind of collector, whose obsession was knowledge. And if so, what would he do with a new specimen for his collection? Me. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The area around the Tsutenkaku Tower was a carnival of faded glory. The air smelled of fried skewers and stale cigarette smoke. Tourists posed with the giant blowfish lantern of the Zubareya restaurant. It was a pocket of noisy, chaotic, old-world Osaka, and for a moment, I felt a surge of relief. Here, surely, the quiet contagion couldn't take hold. I was wrong. It was just different. A takoyaki vendor wasn't just flipping octopus balls, he was arranging the bonito flakes on top into swirling logarithmic spirals. A street performer wasn't juggling, he was just tossing 3 red balls in the exact same arc, over and over, his face blank, oblivious to the sparse crowd. The contagion didn't erase chaos, it colonized it, finding patterns within it. Kenji was waiting for me on a bench, looking out of place in his crisp university uniform. He had a notebook in his lap, the same kind as mine, with a different cartoon animal on the cover. "Sensei," he said, not looking at me. "Thank you for coming." "Kenji, what is happening?" I asked, sitting beside him, my voice tight. "The collections, the patterns, you see it too, don't you?" He finally turned to me. His eyes were clear, intelligent, and utterly devoid of the placid glaze I saw in everyone else. But there was something else there, an intensity that was just as unsettling. "See it?" he said, a small, wry smile on his face. "Sensei, I'm mapping it." He opened his notebook. It was not a journal of fear, like mine. It was a scientific document. There were pages of complex diagrams, charting the arrangements of Mrs. Tanaka's fish. There were transcriptions of what he thought were Mr. Endo's number sequences. There were charts cross-referencing the types of collections with the demographics of the collectors. "I started noticing it about 8 months ago," he said, his voice calm, academic. "First with my grandmother. She began collecting cicada shells. Then my father, with train ticket stubs. At first, I thought it was a social fad. A meme. But it's deeper. It's not mimetic. It's syntactic. Syntactic? Like grammar? Exactly, he said, his eyes gleaming with intellectual fire. It's a language. Or the precursor to one. A new operating system for the human brain. People aren't losing their minds, sensei. They are finding a new kind of mind. One based on recursive, ordered classification of the physical world. I felt a cold dread wash over me. He wasn't my ally. He wasn't a fellow resistor. He was a collaborator. A linguist studying a newly discovered tongue, thrilled by its elegance. But it's meaningless, I argued, my voice shaking. Paperclips, bottle caps, it's junk. It means nothing. Does the letter have meaning? He countered. Or is it just a shape? Its meaning comes from its position relative to B and C. Its meaning comes from its function within a system. The collectors are learning the alphabet. Soon, they will start forming words. Then sentences. His theory was insane, but it fit the horrifying logic of what I was seeing. The silent, coordinated escalation. The shift from simple piles to complex arrangements. They were practicing. My collection, he said, tapping his notebook, is of the system itself. I am collecting the grammar. I am perhaps the first to become fluent. He looked at me, and I finally understood the look in his eyes. It was pity. You, sensei, are illiterate. It must be very frightening. The conversation had given me an answer, but it was more terrifying than the mystery. This wasn't an illness. It was an evolution, or an invasion of consciousness itself. It wasn't random, it was organized. And its quiet, orderly nature was its greatest strength. It didn't destroy society, it simply rewrote it from the inside out. The stakes were no longer just about my personal sanity. The world was changing, and I was being left behind, a relic of an old way of thinking. The pressure escalated. At work, Mr. Sato presented me with a performance review. It wasn't a document. It was a box. Inside were hundreds of colored pushpins. Your lesson structures lack symmetry, he said, his voice flat. Use these. Find a more harmonious pattern for information delivery. When I didn't immediately take the box, he simply placed it on my desk. It sat there all day, a silent ultimatum. My apartment building had become a hive. The sounds were more synchronized now. At precisely 10 p.m. every night, a wave of soft, rhythmic activity would sweep through the concrete structure. Clicking, sorting, humming, sanding. A lullaby of obsession. I started putting in earplugs, but I could feel the vibrations through the floor. One evening, there was a knock on my door. It was Mrs. Tanaka and Mr. Endo, standing side by side. It was the first time I had ever seen them together. They looked like a delegation. Mrs. Tanaka was holding a small, empty lacquered box. Mr. Endo held a single, perfectly smooth, gray stone. Clara-san, Mrs. Tanaka said, her smile gentle but insistent. Your collection box is empty. This is not good. There can be no empty sets. A system cannot tolerate a null value, Mr. Endo added, his voice a dry rustle. He held out the stone. A beginning. A seed. I stared at them, at the stone, at the empty box. This was it. The friendly persuasion was over. This was an induction ceremony. My mind raced. Kenji's words echoed in my head, a new operating system. My brain, with its chaotic emotions, its messy memories, its reliance on abstract, spoken language, was obsolete. They were offering me an upgrade. I need to think, I stammered, backing away from the door. Their faces didn't change. There was no anger, no disappointment. Just a placid, patient certainty. The pattern will wait, Mrs. Tanaka said. But not forever. Order must be completed. They left the stone on my doormat, perfectly centered. I closed the door, my back sliding down it until I was sitting on the floor. I looked at the box of offerings in my closet, at the push pins on my desk, at the bicycle wheel still leaning against my wall. They weren't gifts. They were vocabulary words. And I was being told it was time to start speaking the language. My temporary alliance with Kenji was a fraud. He wasn't on my side, he was simply on the side of the phenomenon itself. I was utterly, completely alone, a bug in a program that was slowly, methodically debugging itself. My very existence, my resistance, was the null value they couldn't tolerate. The question was no longer how to fight it, but whether I could survive being erased. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4. Confrontation/revelation and aftermath. The next few days were a blur of hypervigilance. I felt like a cornered animal. The world outside my apartment had taken on a terrifying new clarity. I could see the patterns everywhere, in everything. The way pedestrians on a crosswalk unconsciously sorted themselves by the color of their coats. The flicker of the streetlights, not random, but a complex binary sequence. The way the leaves on the trees seemed to rustle in synchronized waves. Was the world always like this? And I was just now seeing the code. Or was the code rewriting the world? The distinction no longer seemed to matter. The confrontation came, as I knew it would, not with a bang, but with a quiet knock. It was a Saturday afternoon. I opened the door to find Mrs. Tanaka, Mr. Endo, and two other neighbors I barely knew. They weren't smiling anymore. Their faces were serene, placid, like statues waiting for a pigeon to land. Mrs. Tanaka held out the empty lacquered box again. "It is time, Clara-san," she said. Her voice was melody, but the words were a command. An empty space is a disruption. It creates noise in the system. The sequence must be contiguous, Mr. Endo added, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder, as if calculating the dimensions of my resistance. This was not a physical threat. I could have slammed the door. I could have screamed. But what then? I would be a disturbance, a glitch to be isolated and quarantined. They would not hurt me. They would simply arrange me. Pack me away. Make me part of a different, more final collection. The horror was in their absolute certainty, their shared, silent consensus. In their world, I was the one who was sick. I was the one spreading chaos. My eyes fell on the stone they had left me days before. It was still on the floor just inside my door. It was simple, gray, unremarkable. A piece of the world, stripped of context, waiting to be given a place in a new one. I looked past them, down the hallway. The door to apartment 4A was slightly ajar. I saw my neighbor, a young woman I'd shared awkward elevator rides with, sitting on her floor. She had hundreds of postage stamps, and she was arranging them by color, her movements fluid and economical. She was humming the same low, monotonous tune as Mr. Endo. She looked peaceful. She looked purposeful. She looked free. Free from what? Free from the burden of choice. Free from the chaos of emotion, the pain of loneliness, the struggle to connect through the clumsy, imprecise medium of words. Kenji's words came back to me. They are learning the alphabet. What if he was right? What if this was the next step? A global consciousness linked not by technology, but by a shared, tangible syntax of things. A world without misunderstanding because there was nothing to misunderstand. There was only the pattern. My heart hammered in my chest. I had come to Japan to escape, to be quiet, to disappear. And here was the ultimate disappearance, the dissolution of the self into a vast, intricate, beautiful, and utterly inhuman design. I looked at Mrs. Tanaka's ancient, knowing eyes. At Mr. Endo's placid certainty. I saw my own reflection in the polished surface of the lacquered box, a face pale with terror, a relic of a forgotten age. My fight was over. You can't win a war when you're the only one who knows you're fighting. Slowly, deliberately, I bent down. My hand closed around the cool, smooth surface of the gray stone. It felt solid, real. A single, defined variable in a world of terrifying complexity. I straightened up and placed the stone inside the empty box. It made a soft, definitive clink. A change occurred in the delegation at my door. It was almost imperceptible. A collective relaxation of shoulders. The faintest hint of a shared smile, not of victory, but of completion. A circuit closed. A line of code executed. A good start, Mrs. Tanaka said, and she sounded like she meant it. They bowed, a perfect, synchronized motion, and departed, leaving me alone in my doorway. I closed the door and leaned against it, the lacquered box heavy in my hands. I walked over to the window. Outside, the world hummed with its secret rhythm. I didn't feel defeated. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet. I walked over to the cardboard box in my closet, the one filled with their offerings. The paper clips. The ramen packets. The bottle caps. I took it out and emptied its contents onto the floor. Junk. A pile of meaningless junk. But then I looked closer. I saw the glint of metal, the crinkle of cellophane, the dull red of a plastic cap. I saw shapes. Colors. Textures. I picked up a paperclip. Then another. I placed them side by side, just as they had been left for me. Then I added a third. My movements were slow at first, clumsy. But then they found a rhythm. I wasn't thinking. I was just doing. Sorting. Arranging. Finding the pattern. Hours passed. The sun set, casting long, geometric shadows across my floor. The room was filled with the soft, metallic click of my work. I was building something. A spiral, branching out from the center, incorporating the bottle caps as accents, the ramen packets as structural boundaries. It was intricate. It was mine. A profound, astonishing sense of peace settled over me. The constant buzz of anxiety in my head, the gnawing loneliness, the fear, it all just faded. Replaced by a clear, simple purpose. The stone in the box. The paper clips on the floor. One thing after another. The order is the only thing that matters. I am Clara. I am a collector of fallen cherry blossom petals. I find them on my way to work. Each one is unique in its decay, in its delicate blush of pink against the browning edges. I bring them home. I place them in the lacquered box. My collection is small, but it is growing. It is orderly. It connects me to the seasons, to the city, to the pattern of all things. It gives such clarity. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My world is measured in kilometers and kilocalories. I am Yusuf, and my office is a 67 square centimeter thermal cube strapped to my back. My colleagues are the relentless ping of the Blitzessen app and the whirring electric hum of my bicycle's rear hub. Berlin is not a city to me, it is a matrix of optimal routes, a cartographical puzzle I solve a dozen times a day for a wage that barely covers my small room in Neukölln. This life is a deliberate construction of simplicity. My previous one, in Aleppo, was a labyrinth of complexities I was lucky to escape. Here, the rules are clear: receive order, collect food, deliver food, repeat. In the transactional silence of the gig economy, I found a strange sort of peace. Anonymity is its own form of safety. I am just a blue jacket, a moving dot on a customer's phone screen. The first thread to unravel was so thin I barely noticed it. It was Frau Schmidt in Charlottenburg. A third-floor apartment in a stately, cream-colored Altbau. The first time I delivered her prescription from the apotheke, she buzzed me in and met me at her door. "Leave it on the third step from the top," she'd said, her voice raspy. "The doorbell inside is broken. Please, do not knock." My husband is unwell. A perfectly normal, considerate instruction. I did as she asked. A week later, another delivery to Frau Schmidt, this time a small bag of groceries. Through the intercom, the same voice, the same cadence, leave it on the third step from the top. The doorbell inside is broken. Please, do not knock. My husband is unwell. A little strange, I thought. A creature of habit. I smiled to myself, placed the bag on the designated polished wood step, and left. The third time was 2 weeks after that. A sushi order. The intercom crackled to life. Leave it on the third step from the top. The doorbell inside is broken. Please, do not knock. My husband is unwell. The repetition was no longer charming, it was a stuck record. A prickle of unease traced a line up my spine. This time, I decided to break the script. Of course, Frau Schmidt, I said into the grill, trying to sound cheerful. You told me before. I remember. There was a pause. Not a thoughtful pause, but a dead one. A silence like a dropped call. Then, the voice again, flat, devoid of any recognition. Leave it on the third step from the top. The doorbell inside is broken. Please, do not knock. My husband is unwell. The connection clicked off. The buzz of the door unlocking sounded louder than usual. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp November air. I took the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the immaculate, silent hall. I placed the bag on the third step, a step now imbued with a weird significance, like a shrine to a forgotten god. As I turned to leave, I couldn't resist a glance at her door. It was heavy, dark wood, with a small brass nameplate, Schmidt. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But I had the distinct, unnerving feeling that on the other side of that door, there was no sick husband. There was perhaps nothing at all. I tried to shake it off. Berlin was full of eccentrics. I had delivered to people who answered the door in chainmail, to apartments that were just empty rooms with a single mattress, to parties that fell silent the moment the food arrived. A woman with a verbal tic was nothing. But then came Lucas, the student in Friedrichshain. Every Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork, he ordered a large vegan pizza. And every time, his instructions, delivered through the app's chat function, were identical. Not similar. Identical. Buzz apt 4B. I will come down. The elevator is too slow. No punctuation. No variation. The first few times, I thought nothing of it. Then, I started looking for it, dreading the familiar string of text. One Friday, I arrived before he'd sent the message. I buzzed 4B. He came down, a lanky boy with tired eyes and headphones perpetually around his neck. Hey, I said, handing him the pizza. Beat you to it today. No message. He looked at me, a flicker of profound confusion in his eyes. He glanced at his phone, then back at me. His brow furrowed. What message? The one you always send, I said, my voice sounding strained. Buzz APT4B. I will come down. The elevator is too slow. Lucas shook his head slowly, a complete and utter blank. I don't do that. I just wait for the buzz. He took the pizza, gave a hesitant, weirded out smile, and retreated into the building. I stood on the pavement, the warmth of the pizza box gone from my hands, replaced by a deep, internal cold. He wasn't lying. I was certain of it. The confusion in his eyes was genuine. It was the look of someone being told an impossible fact about themselves. I started to question my own mind. I was working long hours. The city lights at night, the constant motion, the lack of deep sleep, it was a recipe for mental fatigue. Was I inventing these patterns? Imposing order on the chaos of my job because my own life felt so disordered? My past was a testament to how quickly reality could fracture. Perhaps I had brought the cracks with me from Syria, and now they were starting to show, hairline fissures in the new life I had so carefully built. I tried to focus on the concrete. The cobblestones of the Kurfürstendamm, slick with rain. The scent of roasting nuts from a street vendor. The distant siren. These things were real. Frau Schmidt and Lucas were just data points, anomalies in a system that was otherwise functional. I told myself this over and over, a mantra against the creeping dread. Then came the little things. A kiosk owner on Sonnenallee, where I'd stop for a coffee. I noticed him one day, polishing the glass of his display case. He polished the same corner, a small circle, over and over, for the entire 5 minutes I was there. His eyes were distant, his movements smooth and automatic. The next day, the same thing. The same spot. A perfect, mindless loop. A woman at the Cottbusser Tor U-Bahn station, waiting for the U8. Every morning, I'd see her as I cycled past. And every morning, she would be retying the lace of her right shoe. The same shoe. The same deliberate, focused motions. These weren't just habits. They were fragments of code, executing on repeat. The city was starting to feel like a simulation, and some of its inhabitants were glitching. And I, the anonymous man on the bike, was the only one who seemed to see the seams starting to show. I started taking different routes, avoiding Frau Schmidt Street, declining orders from Lucas's building. I tried to curate my reality, to cut out the unsettling parts. But the feeling followed me. It was in the air, in the hum of the overhead train lines, in the blank stares of people I passed. A quiet contagion, not of the body, but of behavior. And the terrifying question that kept me awake at night was no longer is this happening? But why can only I see it? My sanctuary, my simple, predictable job, had become a window into a world that was slowly, silently, coming undone. My name is Yusuf, and I was beginning to fear that I was the last real person in Berlin. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The rationalizations began to feel thin, like worn-out clothes that could no longer protect me from the cold. Stress, fatigue, trauma, they were all plausible explanations, but they couldn't account for the sheer, systemic strangeness of it all. The world was not just odd, it was becoming internally inconsistent. My isolation deepened. The few people I interacted with were either customers, increasingly a source of dread, or other riders. I tried to talk to Omar, a fellow Syrian who had been in Berlin a few years longer than me. We'd often share a cigarette and complain about the app, the weather, the tourists. He was my one anchor to a shared reality. Omar, have you ever noticed people repeating things? I asked one evening, our bikes parked by the Landwehr Canal. The exact same words, every time. He took a long drag from his cigarette, squinting at the water. You mean like, keep the change? Yeah, I wish. He laughed. No, something more specific. More, unnatural. I told him about Frau Schmidt. I didn't mention Lucas or the others, I didn't want to sound completely mad. Omar shrugged, exhaling a plume of smoke. Old people, man. They get stuck in their ways. My grandmother used to tell me the same story about a pomegranate tree every time I saw her. Don't worry about it. You're just tired. We're all tired. He was trying to be reassuring, but his easy dismissal was a wall I couldn't breach. He saw an old woman, I saw a broken algorithm. The gulf between our perceptions was immense. After that conversation, I stopped trying to explain. The anomaly was my secret, my burden. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on me like the heavy thermal cube on my back. I started a journal. Not a diary of feelings, but a logbook of glitches. A cheap, grid paper notebook I bought from a stationery shop. November 12, Frau Schmidt. Third step, husband is unwell. Fifth recorded instance. November 14th, Lucas in Friedrichshain. Ordered pizza 2 hours early. Claimed no knowledge of automated message. November 15th, kiosk owner, Sonnenalley. Polishing same spot. Timed him, 7 minutes and 14 seconds. No break in rhythm. November 17th, U-Bahn woman, Cottbusser Tor. Right shoe. Always the right shoe. The act of writing them down made them real, undeniable. But it also made me feel like a man documenting his own descent into psychosis. The breaking point, the moment my fear curdled into something colder and sharper, happened on a Tuesday. The app pinged with a lucrative order, a large catering delivery from a fancy restaurant in Mitte to an architectural firm. The address was Castanienweg 14. Castanienweg. Chestnut Way. I knew it. A small, charming side street I'd delivered to a few times before, tucked away between two larger avenues. It was distinctive for its canopy of old chestnut trees and its beautifully restored facades. It was a good delivery, the tips were always generous. I collected the bags of food, the smell of truffle oil and roasted duck filling my cube, and set off. I navigated the familiar route, turning off Friedrichstrasse, expecting to see the familiar opening of the small street. It wasn't there. Where the entrance to Castanienweg should have been, there was now the solid, unbroken wall of a new, featureless office building. It wasn't under construction, it looked like it had been there for a decade, its gray concrete panels stained with rain. I stopped my bike, my heart hammering against my ribs. I blinked, expecting the scene to correct itself. It didn't. This was impossible. I had been here 2 months ago. I knew this corner. I got off my bike and walked to the wall, touching its rough, cold surface. There was no seam, no sign of recent construction. It was just a building. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Had I taken a wrong turn? Was my memory that faulty? I pulled out my phone. The Blitzessen app still showed my destination as a pin dropped in the middle of this new building. I switched to my map app. I typed Castanienweg, Berlin. No results found. I typed it again, checking the spelling. Kastanienweg. No results found. I zoomed in on the satellite view. It showed exactly what I was seeing, a solid block of a building. The street was gone, not just in reality, but from the digital record that governs our lives. Panic seized me. A cold, suffocating wave. I fumbled through my phone's photo gallery, my hands shaking. I remembered taking a picture there in late summer, struck by how the sun filtered through the chestnut leaves. I scrolled back, my thumbs swiping frantically past pictures of my bike, receipts, a blurry photo of Omar. And then I found it. The photo was from August. I recognized the sliver of the blue sky, the distinctive red brick building that stood at the far end of the street. But where Castanienweg and its beautiful trees should have been, there was nothing. Not a black square, not a corrupted file error, but a smooth, seamless, gray void. It was a patch of non-existence, a hole in the fabric of the image itself, perfectly outlining where the street had been. The photo was a record not of the street, but of its erasure. I felt a guttural sob rise in my throat. I was holding proof of an impossibility. A scar on a memory. I had to cancel the order, marking it as unable to find address. The app's algorithm would penalize my rating, but I didn't care. I rode my bike in a daze to Tempelhoferfeld, the vast, empty space of the former airport. I sat on a bench, watching the kite surfers glide across the grasslands, and I stared at the photograph on my phone. The gray void. It wasn't an absence of light or color. It was an absence of information. An absence of being. This was the secondary mystery that consumed me. The glitches, the loops, they were behavioral. But this was ontological. A piece of the city had been surgically removed from reality, and the wound had been cauterized so perfectly that no one else felt the phantom pain. My research became frantic. I spent my evenings in the state library, poring over old city maps, historical atlases. In a detailed tourist map from 1998, I found it. A thin line, labeled Castanianweg. My heart leaped. I wasn't insane. It had been real. I took a photo of the map with my phone, a piece of corroborating evidence. But when I looked at the photo on my screen, the line labeled Castanianweg was gone. The space between the two avenues was empty, the paper texture of the map seamlessly intact. The anomaly wasn't just erasing reality, it was retroactively erasing the record of reality. My own phone, my own camera, had become a tool of the contagion, cleaning up after it. From that day on, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I was a man with a memory of a world that no longer existed. The looping people, Frau Schmidt and her script, Lucas and his amnesia, they weren't the ones who were broken. They were the ones who had adapted. They were running on the new operating system, their memories patched and updated to be consistent with the revised reality. I was the glitch. I was the one running legacy software, holding on to deprecated data. The feeling of isolation was no longer just a feeling, it was a fundamental state of being. I was the only one who remembered the chestnuts, the only one who knew about the street that wasn't there. And every ping from my app, every delivery I made, felt like I was cycling deeper into a quiet, orderly, and utterly terrifying new world that was erasing its past, one street, one memory at a time. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The disappearance of Castanianweg changed the nature of my fear. It was no longer a passive dread but an active, gnawing paranoia. I started to see the city not as a physical space, but as a vast, editable document. The loops and glitches weren't random errors, they were symptoms of the editing process. A process of simplification. Of optimization. My theory, scribbled frantically in my notebook, was terrifying in its cold logic. Reality was being streamlined. Redundancies were being removed. Why have a dozen different ways to greet a delivery driver when one scripted, efficient phrase would do? Why maintain a minor, residential street when its space could be used for a single, solid, data-efficient block? It was like reality itself was being compressed, like a digital file, to save space. The loops were cached behaviors. The erasures were deletions. But who, or what, was the editor? There was no Bond villain in a volcano lair, no shadowy corporation. The thought that felt truest, and most horrifying, was that there was no one in control. It was an emergent phenomenon. A runaway process, an entropic decay of complexity into a simpler, more stable state. Reality was tidying itself up. My search for answers, for another soul who saw the cracks, became my sole obsession. My delivery ratings plummeted. I took only enough jobs to pay my rent, spending the rest of my time observing, documenting, cycling through the city like a detective in a crime with no perpetrator. It was during one of these obsessive patrols in Prenzlauer Berg that I saw her. She was standing across the street from a small cafe, not looking at the cafe itself, but at its shadow. It was late afternoon, and the sun cast a long, sharp silhouette of the building onto the pavement. The woman, maybe in her late 30s with a mess of dark hair and an intense, focused gaze, was sketching furiously in a notepad. I watched her for a few minutes. She wasn't drawing the building. She was drawing the shadow, but her pencil strokes were agitated, confused. She would draw a line, then erase it, then stare at the shadow with a look of profound frustration. Then I saw it. The shadow of the cafe's chimney was bent at an impossible angle. It twisted on the flat pavement as if it were falling over a curb that wasn't there. It was a small, geometric impossibility, a flicker of wrongness that lasted only a moment before the sun shifted and the angle corrected itself. But she had seen it. Her whole body was rigid with the same panicked validation I had felt when I found Castanianweg on that old map. I crossed the street, my heart pounding. This was it. I had to take the risk. The shadow, I said, my voice barely a whisper. It was wrong. She flinched, snapping her sketchbook shut and clutching it to her chest like a shield. Her eyes, wide and wary, darted over me, the blue Blitzessen jacket, the worn-out look. I was just another piece of the urban landscape she was used to ignoring. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her German sharp and clipped. She started to turn away. Castanianweg, I blurted out, the name feeling like a sacred, dangerous word on my tongue. In mit. It's gone. She stopped dead. Her shoulders tensed. She turned back to me slowly, her suspicion now warring with a desperate spark of recognition. What did you say? The street with the chestnut trees. It's not there anymore. But I remember it. Her face crumbled, the defensive mask falling away to reveal a terror and exhaustion that mirrored my own. The glitches, she whispered. You see the glitches, too. Her name was Lena. She was a doctoral candidate in theoretical physics, though she wryly called herself a failed artist. Her apartment, a chaotic space filled with books, star charts, and half-finished canvases, became our sanctuary, our war room. For the first time in months, I wasn't alone. We spent hours comparing notes, my logbook of behavioral loops and her sketches of impossible geometries and transient phenomena. She'd seen reflections appear in non-reflective surfaces, heard conversations playing back on a time delay in empty rooms, watched pigeons in a park move in perfect, synchronized patterns that defied flocking behavior. It's not a virus, it's not aliens, she explained, pacing her small living room, the city lights twinkling below. I think it's an information problem. Reality is a quantum waveform, a superposition of all possibilities. Observation collapses it into a single state. What if something is, simplifying the waveform? Reducing the number of possibilities before the collapse? Making reality more, computationally efficient. Her theory was abstract, terrifying, and it fit everything I had seen. The world was being optimized by an invisible hand. And we were the incompatible data. Our alliance gave me strength, but it also escalated the stakes. Lena wasn't content to just hide and observe. She wanted to find the source, the locus of the phenomenon. Her research pointed to something new being rolled out across Berlin, a next-generation quantum communications network, its nodes hidden in plain sight atop buildings, in subway tunnels, in innocuous-looking server cabinets. It's not designed to do this, she insisted. It's a side effect. A catastrophic, reality-degrading side effect. If we can find a primary node, maybe we can understand the signal. Maybe we can shield ourselves from it. Her obsession drove us to take risks. We started mapping the glitches, trying to find a pattern, a geographic concentration. Our investigation led us to a vast, windowless data processing center on the industrial outskirts of the city, a monolithic block of concrete humming with an almost subaudible energy. It felt like the heart of the anomaly. The consequences of our probing were subtle at first, then terrifyingly direct. One day, a cafe we had spent an afternoon in, discussing our theories, was simply gone the next. Replaced by a laundromat that looked like it had been there for 20 years. The owner didn't remember us. No one did. Our shared memory of that afternoon was now an island, disconnected from the mainland of reality. The loops and scripts were becoming more pervasive. Whole conversations in the street would happen verbatim as I passed them on different days. The city was losing its randomness, its beautiful, chaotic noise. It was being smoothed into a predictable, repeating pattern. The breaking point of our alliance came when Lena developed a new, terrifying fixation. She believed the erasures and loops were a form of data compression, but that the original information wasn't lost, just archived. She became convinced she could access it. She started staring into reflective surfaces, windows, puddles, the screen of her own phone, for hours on end, claiming she could see ghosts of the deleted world. I saw Castanianweg, Yusuf, she told me one night, her eyes wide with a manic gleam. Just for a second. In the reflection on the spree. The trees, the light. It's all still there, just on a different layer. I was terrified for her. She wasn't just observing the contagion anymore, she was trying to interface with it. She was leaning into the madness, while I was still desperately trying to outrun it. The very thing that brought us together, our shared perception of the wrongness, was now pulling us apart. She wanted to dive in, I wanted to find a way out. The humming of the world was getting louder. The glitches were more frequent. And I had the terrible premonition that our investigation, our shared awareness, had flagged us. We were no longer just observers. We were errors in the system. And the system was very, very good at correcting its errors. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The end of my alliance with Lena was not a fight or a disagreement. It was an erasure. I went to her apartment one Thursday morning with a fresh map where I'd marked a new cluster of geometric anomalies near the Tiergarten. I buzzed her apartment. Nothing. I buzzed again, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Finally, the intercom crackled. It was a man's voice, irritated. Bit? I'm here for Lena, I said. Who? There's no Lena here. You have the wrong apartment. No, apartment 6C. Lena Richter. Dark hair, a physicist, my voice trailed off. I already knew. I've lived here for 5 years, my friend. My name is Klaus. There has never been a Lena here. Now, please. The intercom clicked off. I stumbled back from the door, my legs weak. I looked at the nameplate. K. Bauer. I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling, and went to my call log. Her name was gone. The texts we had exchanged were gone. I opened my notes app, where I'd transcribed some of her theories. The pages were now filled with meaningless, repetitive strings of characters, like a corrupted file. The shadow, the shadow, the shadow, the shadow, the shadow, the shadow. She had been deleted. Her pursuit of the archived data, her attempt to peer behind the curtain, had made her too much of a variance. She wasn't just an observer anymore, she was an active threat to the system's integrity. And so, she was gone. Her apartment, her name, her very existence scrubbed from the record with horrifying efficiency. The only place Lena Richter still existed was inside my head. I was a living tomb for a memory the world had disowned. This was my confrontation. Not with a monster or a machine, but with a silent, implacable process. The threat wasn't death. It was nullification. To be noticed by the anomaly was to be marked for deletion. My frantic investigation, my logbook, my search for answers, it was all just painting a target on my back. Panic gave way to a chilling clarity. The goal was not to understand. The goal was not to fight. The goal was to become invisible. To survive, I had to stop resisting the current. I had to learn the script. I went home and burned my notebook. I watched the pages full of my terror and discovery curl into black ashes. It felt like burning a part of my own mind, but it was a necessary amputation. I went back to work. Full time. I embraced the rhythm, the exhaustion. I stopped looking for glitches. I forced myself not to see the man polishing the same spot of glass, not to notice when a building's shadow fell at a wrong angle. I practiced ignorance. A week later, the test came. A ping on the app. An order from a pharmacy. The destination, a name I hadn't seen in months, a name that sent a jolt of pure ice through my veins. Frau Schmidt. I accepted the delivery. My heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. This was it. A final exam. Was I still flagged as an error? Or had my recent conformity rendered me harmless? I cycled to the stately building in Charlottenburg. I walked up to the familiar intercom. My mind was a maelstrom of memories, the first time I heard her voice, my clumsy attempt to break the loop, my conversation about her with Omar. All of it was dangerous data. All of it had to be suppressed. I pressed the button. The intercom crackled. For a moment, there was only silence. A long, terrible pause where I felt the system scanning me, weighing my deviance. I held my breath. Then, her voice, flat and unchanged. Leave it on the third step from the top. The doorbell inside is broken. Please, do not knock. My husband is unwell. I had a choice. I could say, I know. I could say her name. I could prove that I remembered, that I was still the person I used to be. Or I could surrender. I leaned towards the metal grill. I cleared my throat. And I recited the creed of the new world. Understood, I said, my voice as neutral and devoid of personality as I could make it. Third step. No knock. Got it. The door buzzed open instantly. The sound was a verdict. An acquittal. I had passed. I walked up the silent, polished stairs. The air was thick with the feeling of unseen routines. I placed the small paper bag on the third step. It felt different now. Not a strange anomaly, but a sacrament. An act of compliance. As I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the polished dark wood of her door. For a split second, a horrifying optical flicker, my features seemed to blur. My nose, my mouth, the lines of worry around my eyes, they softened, becoming less distinct, more generic. The face of 1,000 other delivery drivers. I squeezed my eyes shut, and when I opened them, my reflection was normal again. But I knew what I had seen. It was the process of integration. I was being smoothed over, my own sharp edges of identity being sanded down to fit. I got back on my bike. The Berlin air felt the same, but the world was fundamentally different. I was no longer a ghost haunting a glitching reality. I was becoming part of the glitch. The app pinged. A new order. A pizza delivery to Friedrichshain. The notes from the customer appeared on my screen. Buzz apt 4B. I will come down. The elevator is too slow. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel dread. I felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. The peace of the cog that has found its place in the machine. I knew the script. I knew my lines. I was no longer Yusuf, the man who fled a broken city only to find another. I was just a function. A moving dot on a map. And in this quiet, contagious new world, anonymity was no longer a form of safety. It was the only form of survival. I pedaled forward, into the gathering dusk, another delivery to make, another line to recite, perfectly safe, as long as I remembered to forget. Shadowlight. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The fog is San Francisco's first whisper. It doesn't shout its arrival, it breathes onto the glass of my bay window, blurring the city into a watercolor of gray and muted gold. I've lived in this inner Richmond apartment for 4 years, and the fog is the most reliable colleague I have. It shows up for work, does its job, and asks for nothing in return. I appreciate that. My name is Leo. I'm a user experience designer, which is a fancy way of saying I spend 10 hours a day arguing with project managers about the optimal placement of a button that will, in all likelihood, be ignored by 90% of users. My job is to craft seamless, intuitive digital pathways. Logic is my trade, pattern my language. I build predictable systems for unpredictable people. I work from home, a state of affairs that transitioned from a temporary pandemic measure to a permanent feature of my life with an ease that was both a relief and a quiet indictment. My world has contracted to the 3 rooms of this apartment, the glow of my dual monitors, and the view from this window. The view is dominated by two things: the gnarled branches of a cypress tree in the tiny yard below, and the stoic, slightly hunched form of a streetlight at the corner of my block. It's an old-timer, one of the high-pressure sodium models that casts a nostalgic, distinctly orange light, a dying breed in a city rapidly converting to the cold, blue-white glare of LEDs. I've always preferred its warmth. It makes the fog look like a living, breathing thing. The first time it happened, I didn't even register it. It was a Tuesday. I was deep in a wireframe for a new banking app, trying to make the process of seeing your balance dwindle a delightful experience. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from my sister. At the exact same moment, the streetlight outside blinked. Not a flicker, not the hesitant stutter of a dying bulb, but a single, clean off on. A digital wink. I glanced up, blinked back, and thought nothing of it. Coincidence? The city is an old beast, its wiring creaks and groans. A few days later, the DoorDash guy rang the buzzer for my pad thai. As my thumb hovered over the "talk" button on the intercom, the light did it again. Off on. Precise, like a keystroke. This time, a sliver of curiosity wedged itself into my brain. I'm a pattern recognition machine, it's what I'm paid for. I opened a new note on my desktop, a file I named light_log.txt. Friday, 8:17 p.m. Single blink. Corresponds to building buzzer. It felt absurd, the kind of thing you do when you've been alone for too long. A symptom of cabin fever. I almost deleted the file. But my professional instincts, the part of me that documents every tiny system behavior, stayed my hand. The log grew. It was slow at first, filled with entries I could easily dismiss. Monday, 11:02 a.m. Double blink, fast. Corresponds to email from Sarah, manager. Probably just saw the notification banner out of the corner of my eye and my brain stitched the two events together. Wednesday, 3:45 p.m. Single blink. Corresponds to Slack message from Chloe. Chloe messages me every day around that time. It's our post-lunch check-in. Statistical noise. Chloe is my only real tether to the world outside these walls. We've been friends since our disastrous stint at a startup that burned through its venture capital in 6 months. She's a force of nature, a publicist who seems to genuinely enjoy networking events. She calls me her hermit crab and periodically tries to lure me out of my shell with promises of artisanal cocktails or gallery openings. I mostly decline. "You're going to fossilize in there, Leo," she said during our video call last week. "I'm not fossilizing, I'm optimizing," I retorted, leaning back in my ergonomic chair. "I've eliminated my commute, my dry cleaning bills, and all non-essential social friction. Social friction is what makes us human. It's not a bug, it's a feature," says the woman who once described a difficult client as a non-intuitive user interface. She laughed, a bright, genuine sound that made my apartment feel a little less gray. "You got me there. Just see some sunlight, okay? The kind that doesn't come from a screen. I promised I would. I didn't." The log continued to fill. The patterns became less deniable. A single blink was an external stimulus, a knock, a call, a text. A double blink was a digital stimulus, an email, a Slack message, a software update. There was a logic to it, a terrifyingly consistent logic. The light wasn't just flickering, it was communicating. It was a notification system for my life. The true turning point, the moment that tipped me from quirky observation into the cold waters of genuine dread, happened a month into my logging. I was wrestling with a complex user flow, my brain tangled in knots. I felt a familiar headache building behind my eyes. I pushed back from the desk, thinking, I need coffee. A proper cup. And the streetlight blinked. A new pattern. Not the sharp, staccato blinks I'd grown accustomed to. This was different. It was a slow pulse. A long, gentle fade to black, a pause that lasted a full second, and a slow, blooming return to its orange glow. Thursday, 2:12 p.m. Slow pulse. Corresponds to, my own thought. I stared at the words on my screen. My heart started a frantic, clumsy drum solo against my ribs. This was impossible. This broke every law of physics and sanity. A machine couldn't read my mind. It was a coincidence. A profound, earth-shattering coincidence. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, my movements stiff. I made the coffee, my hands trembling slightly as I scooped the beans into the grinder. As I waited for the water to boil, I stared out the kitchen window, which looks onto a different street. The lights there were steady, normal. It was just mine. My light. I tried to rationalize it. Stress. Isolation. My brain, starved for genuine human interaction, was projecting patterns onto the random noise of the city. I was the ghost in the machine. It was a classic case of apophenia, perceiving meaningful connections in unrelated things. I knew the term. I was a logical person. I could diagnose myself. I went back to my desk, coffee in hand, and forced myself to work. I ignored the window. I put on headphones and blasted instrumental prog rock, drowning the world in complex time signatures. But every few minutes, my eyes would flick to the right, to the bay window where the fog was now thickening, a soft gray curtain drawn around the solitary, orange light. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What if I wasn't imagining it? What if something was actually happening? The thought was absurd, but it was also seductive. My life was a series of controlled loops: wake, work, eat, sleep. The light was a variable I couldn't account for, a rogue element in my carefully curated system. Around 3 a.m., I got out of bed and crept to the window, peering through the slats of the blinds. The street was empty, bathed in that soupy, orange glow. The city was silent except for the distant hum of its own electrical heartbeat. As I watched, the light performed a sequence I had never seen before. Blink. Blink. Pause. Pulse. Blink. A cold sweat broke out on my neck. I had no idea what it meant. There was no corresponding event. No email, no text, no thought I was aware of. It was just a signal. A sentence in a language I was only beginning to learn, broadcast into the empty, foggy night. I stumbled back to my computer and opened the log. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. What could I even write? Signal of unknown meaning. It sounded like a transmission from a failed space probe. A new thought, sharp and clear as a shard of glass, cut through my panic. It's not just responding anymore. The realization landed with the force of a physical blow. The pattern had changed. The system had been updated. I felt a profound, primal fear unfurl in my gut. For a month, I had been the observer, the documentarian of a strange phenomenon. But the new pattern felt different. It felt like the phenomenon was starting to observe me back. I spent the rest of the night at my window, a prisoner in my own home, watching the streetlight. It remained still, casting its steady, warm glow. But it wasn't a comfort anymore. It was a sentinel. And I had the terrifying certainty that it was waiting. Down below, on the street level, a single floor below me, lived Mrs. Gable. She was a sweet woman in her 80s, with hair like spun snow and a collection of porcelain cats that watched from her windowsill. I sometimes helped her with her groceries or her stubbornly uncooperative Wi-Fi router. She was a fixed point of analog kindness in my digital life. The next morning, as I sat numbly at my desk, I saw her through the window. She was on the small patch of lawn in front of our building, a place no one ever used. She was tracing patterns in the dew-wet grass with the tip of her cane. Not randomly. It was a repeating shape, a sort of lopsided figure eight. over and over again. Her expression was placid, almost vacant. I watched her for 10 minutes. The loop was perfect. She'd complete the shape, pause, take a single step to the right, and begin again. It was methodical. It was pointless. And as I watched her, a slow pulse of light, identical to the one from the day before, emanated from the streetlight. The light wasn't watching me. It was watching her. Or she was responding to it. I didn't know which was worse. The contagion, I realized, wasn't just in the wiring. It was in the world. And it was spreading. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The log became my obsession. It was no longer a side project born of curiosity, it was my primary function. My UX work suffered. I delivered wireframes that were technically correct but creatively barren. Sarah, my manager, started adding concerned little postscripts to her emails. "Everything okay, Leo? You seem a bit disengaged." A double blink from the corner of my eye would announce her message before I even saw the notification. Blink blink. Concern. Disengaged. The light's vocabulary was expanding. The sequences grew more complex, incorporating fades, flickers of varying speeds, and subtle shifts in color temperature that I was sure I wasn't imagining, a drift from orange towards a rustier, blood-like hue. I created a spreadsheet, cross-referencing patterns with events, times, and my own emotional state. I was trying to crack the code, to reverse engineer the syntax of reality's new operating system. Mrs. Gable's grass drawing loop became a daily ritual, always performed between 9 o'clock and 9:15 a.m. It was always accompanied by a sequence from the light, pulse blink pulse. I started noticing other things. The mailman, a cheerful guy named Dave who always whistled off-key, began sorting the mail on our stoop in a peculiar way. Instead of stuffing it all in the boxes, he would arrange the letters for our building into small, distinct piles on the top step before distributing them. The pattern was different each day. One day it was 3 piles, the next 5. It looked like a ritual, meaningless and precise. And each time, the light would issue a rapid, chattering flicker, like quiet applause. My world was becoming a tapestry of unsettling synchronicities. A car alarm would blare down the street, and its rhythm would be perfectly matched by a flickering kitchen light in the apartment building across from mine. The mournful horn of a ship in the bay would sound, and the traffic light 2 blocks down would hold its red for an unnaturally long time. These were things no normal person would ever connect. But I had the key. I had the Rosetta Stone glowing orange outside my window. I had to tell someone. The pressure was building inside me like steam in a sealed pipe. I called Chloe. "We need to get a drink," I said, my voice tight. There was a surprised pause on the other end. "Leo? Are you feeling okay? You haven't voluntarily suggested a drink in, ever." "I'm fine. I need to get out. And I need to talk to you about something." "Is this about work? Did Sarah say something about the Braxton project?" "No, it's not work." I hesitated. How could I possibly begin? "Okay," she said slowly. "You're officially scaring me. How about the Alembic?" 8 o'clock. Perfect. The Alembic was a dark, cozy bar on Haight Street, all dark wood and esoteric cocktail ingredients. It felt a world away from my apartment, but the feeling of being watched followed me. Every street I walked down, I found my eyes drawn upwards to the lights. Were they all doing it? Or just mine? I couldn't tell. Was I just hyper-aware now, seeing phantom patterns everywhere? Chloe was already there, a half-empty glass of something pink in front of her. She looked vibrant, alive, a stark contrast to the gray, anxious creature I had become. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her smile faltering as she took in my appearance. "Worse," I mumbled, sliding into the booth. I tried to explain. I started rationally, clinically. I've been observing a phenomenon, I said, trying to sound like a scientist presenting a paper. I told her about the streetlight, the blinks, the initial correlations. She listened patiently, nodding, her expression a careful blend of interest and concern. So, you're saying the streetlight outside your apartment is, what, blinking in Morse code every time you get a text? She asked, a skeptical smile playing on her lips. Not Morse code. It's its own language. And it's not just texts. It's emails, phone calls, everything. Leo, honey, the wiring in this city is 100 years old. It's probably just a short. A short doesn't account for the patterns, Chloe. They're specific. They're consistent. A single blink for an external stimulus, a double for a digital one. It's a binary system. Her smile faded completely. Okay. You've been cooped up for a long time. You're staring at screens all day, you're isolated. Your brain is a pattern-matching machine. It's probably just finding patterns that aren't really there. It's like seeing faces in the clouds. It's not clouds. I said, my voice rising. People at the next table glanced over. I lowered my voice, leaning in. It got weirder. It blinked right after I had a thought. It knew what I was thinking. Chloe's eyes softened with pity, and that was worse than the skepticism. Leo, she began, reaching across the table to touch my hand. Her skin was warm. Maybe you should take some time off. A real vacation. Go somewhere with no streetlights. Go camping. You don't believe me. It wasn't a question. I believe that you believe it, she said gently. And that worries me. A lot. I pulled my hand away. The conversation was useless. I tried to backtrack, to laugh it off as a weird thought experiment, but the damage was done. A wall had gone up between us. She saw a friend spiraling into delusion. I saw the last sane person in a world that was quietly, gracefully going mad. I paid for the drinks and left, leaving her sitting there with a worried look on her face. Walking home through the damp, cold streets, my isolation felt absolute. The city lights seemed to mock me, their steady glow a facade of normalcy. When I got back to my block, I looked up at my window. The light was there. My sentinel. As I fumbled for my keys, it emitted a new sequence, a slow fade, followed by 2 sharp blinks. Pulse blink blink. I had no idea what it meant, but it felt like a judgment. My research grew more frantic. I scoured esoteric forums and physics subreddits for anything similar. I found plenty of conspiracy theories about EMF radiation and government mind control, but nothing that matched the specific, systemic nature of what I was witnessing. I found fragmented posts from years ago, describing odd light behavior in other cities, a user in Chicago talking about traffic lights that seemed to anticipate his route. Another in Tokyo describing the flicker of neon signs matching his heartbeat. They were all dismissed as cranks, their threads quickly descending into mockery before being locked by moderators. Were these other canaries in the coal mine? Or just more lonely people seeing faces in the clouds? I started a secondary investigation, a subplot to my main obsession. The building itself. There was a low, persistent hum that had started recently, a sound just on the edge of hearing. I could only perceive it in the dead of night, a subharmonic thrum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I bought a sound meter, but it registered nothing out of the ordinary. It was a feeling as much as a sound. I tried to ask my downstairs neighbor about it. Not Mrs. Gable, but the young couple in 1A, the Hendersons. I caught Mr. Henderson in the hallway. Hey, have you noticed a weird humming sound lately? At night? He gave me a blank look. Humming? No. Just the usual city noise. He looked me up and down, a flicker of something in his eyes, not suspicion, but a kind of placid disinterest. Is it bothering you? It's unusual, I said. I wouldn't know, he said with a shrug, and walked away. His gait was strange. He had a slight, almost imperceptible limp, a rhythmic dip in his step that I'd never noticed before. Dip, step, step. Dip, step, step. A new loop. My paranoia deepened. Was Chloe right? Was I the one who was broken? I decided to run a definitive test. A controlled experiment. The light seemed to know my intentions, but could it predict an action that was truly random? I wrote down 10 simple, distinct actions on separate slips of paper: drink water, stand up, open a book, check phone, touch left ear, etc. I folded them and put them in a coffee mug. I would draw one at random and perform the action immediately. The light couldn't possibly know which one I would pick. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and plunged my hand into the mug. My fingers closed around a slip of paper. In the split second before I pulled it out, a sequence flashed outside my window. It was incredibly fast, a complex burst of information. Blink flicker pulse blink flicker. My blood ran cold. I opened my eyes and slowly unfolded the paper in my hand. It read, "Look out the window." I dropped the paper as if it were on fire. My chair rolled back and hit the wall with a thud. It wasn't predicting. It wasn't reading my mind. This was something else. This was a command. My random choice hadn't been random at all. I was part of the system I was trying to observe. The mouse hadn't just been in the maze was being built inside the mouse. I scrambled to the window, pressing my palms against the cool glass. I stared at the light, the calm, orange eye of the storm. It was no longer just a data feed. It was the programmer. And then, for the first time, it spoke to me. There was no sound. No voice. But as a new pattern ignited in the glass bulb, a long, deep, resonant pulse, a thought bloomed in my mind, fully formed, in a voice that was not my own. "Hello, Leo." The word echoed in the silent architecture of my skull. It was calm. It was patient. It was ancient. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my carefully constructed world of logic and reason shattering into a million pieces. My isolation was no longer about being the only one who saw the truth. It was about being the only one the truth had decided to talk to. And I was terrified of what it was going to say next. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The whispers changed everything. They weren't constant, but they were devastatingly effective. They were not sounds, but direct-to-brain information packets, delivered via light. A specific series of flickers would pass through my retinas, and the corresponding concept would simply be in my head. There was no translation, no decoding.